We'll be starting up here in about a minute or two for our workshop today. Okay, another 30 seconds. We'll let people log in. While you're doing that, you'll be opening up your windows. We'll be talking about that too, but your little pods. And we will be taking polls, so go ahead and get ready to do polls either online or download the app. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And good morning and welcome to our online workshop on the local federal aid process. We're calling it Local Federal Aid 101. We've been doing this for a bit of time, but always making modifications. Got quite a few today. And we'll be talking about some grant funds that are actually out there right now. One's particular from the state. We will be doing polls, and our goal is to be done around 2:45. And I'll talk about the agenda in a little bit. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here with the New York State LTAP Center. It's part of the Cornell Local Roads program. And it's a good day for doing online training because it's wet all over the state and rainy. Uh, if you haven't been on one of these sessions before, down at the bottom of your screen on the far left, there's an audio settings button. If you have to change things, you can go there. There's a button for the chat pod. You should open that up. That chat pod is where we will send you information, including links to the handout. You should have gotten an email with those links, but just in case, we can resend them there. It's a one-way street. If you want to ask us a question, you'll need to use the Q&A pod. So open that up, and you can send us a question, and we'll get that answered. And of course, we'll be doing polls as well. And I may ask you to raise your hands now and then, just to make sure, answer some simple yes or no questions. This particular session will be worth 3.5 PDHs. And when you look at the agenda, you're going to be like, wait a second, it's 4 hours. Well, the last half hour is a Q&A session with the state and federal folks. And so just the nature of the rules, we can't pre-approve that. So that's not approved for PDHs. So it's 3.5. If it doesn't recognize your poll, I see someone in the Q&A, that's fine. You can just put your answer in the Q&A itself rather than the polls online at PollEV. We're not recording your name for that. That's really just a matter of getting interaction and stuff like that. In fact, we'll go ahead and get started with a couple of polls to show you how all of this works. And yes, I had even bow ties when I was a little, I was 2 when this picture was taken at my grandmother's and grandpapa's. So my sartorial splendor, you can see I'm the short one in the family. I'm not the one on the left, I'm the one on the right. So, okay, so here we go. Again, pollev.com/DavidOrPE. Who do you work for? Town, county, city or village, state or federal, tribal, MPO, consultant, contractor, or like they say, everybody is working for the weekend. And it's a long weekend this week. So let's see what we got here. So about half of you are county, quite a few city and village, some federal and state folks. And again, I see some folks over in the Q&A pod have put in that they're with a county and with consulting, some consulting folks. We have a couple of people who work for the weekends, some MPO folks. Oh, a good variety. I like it. Okay, good to see. Now, where are you from? Okay, so you get to click on this picture. We'll actually have this happen a couple of times during the day. So you get to click on the picture where you're from. It gives me a sense, are you more urban? Are you rural? Where in the state are you? It's just useful. I see we have some folks out in the lake. If you click on it, you can always unclick on it and reset it. And again, you can use the poll because I got somebody mentioned there in the Buffalo area. That's cool. Okay, so a lot of downstate, quite a few variety of folks. I like it. Okay, and again, you can use the poll, the Q&A. And then finally, what is your job? What do you actually do for your agency? Are you an administrator? You're a highway superintendent/commissioner? Are you the engineer? You're the planner? I expect that's going to dominate today, those two groups. Are you actually out in the field? Are you a town supervisor or a board member? You do whatever the boss tells you to do. And of course, you do none of the above. If you do none of the above, I am going to ask you to please uh, put into the Q&A pod what that means. Okay. And again, the chat is a one-way system, the chat pod. That's just where we can send you stuff. The Q&A is where you put your things in. And if you can't access polev.com/DavidOrP, you can always put the answer into the polls. It's fine. Okay. Okay. It's good to see. Okay. Good variety of folks, but there's a lot of engineers. Okay. Okay, what is our schedule today? Well, we're firm believers in the old saying, the mind can absorb what that can endure. And so therefore, we're going to break this into 1 hour chunks. So we're going to start with an hour talking about an introduction to the process for federal aid and what are the roles of the different groups involved. We're focusing on projects that go through the state DOT, but we'll talk about the differences with you getting direct funds if you're a direct recipient from US DOT funds, which does happen. In fact, one of the grants that are out there is dealing with that. We'll take some 15-minute breaks, have another hour together, take a longer lunch break for about 45 minutes, come back and then talk about construction, um, operations and maintenance of your projects after you're done, which might affect your scope. Take one last break, finish with some conclusions, and then we'll have a half an hour or so with some Q&A. And we'll talk about getting your questions over the course of our time together. And we may even have some we've gotten ahead of time that have come up recently with some of the grants that are out there. Again, our goal is to get you out of here around 2:45. Now, who's going to be on this afternoon's poll? Well, we have some folks from the State Department of Transportation and the Local Programs Bureau, Doreen Holsopple and Danielle Duffy will be helping us out. We also have Andrew Sattinger and Robert Zatowski from the Highway Safety Bureau because there is this large grant that's out there that we'll talk about from the Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan. And so if you have any specific questions on that, we might be able to answer them as well. But we're going to try to do that in the context with everything else that is going on. And then we'll be joined by Chris Gatchell with the Federal Highway Administration, who can answer some of your questions dealing with the federal side of the house, if they can. Okay? So we may, and if we add new people, we'll add that in. So that's pretty good. Okay. Now, over the course of the day, in fact, I will make this poll active. This is poll EV. Any questions you've got, you're allowed to put them in. We will compile all of these, and these are the things we will make sure we answer either during the session today or during the Q&A at the end of the day. So any questions you've got, you can put them in here. And again, during each break, I will make sure this particular poll is active. So you can put a question in here and we'll get back to it. And again, I don't expect, like, no. Right now you might have a question, but you can always add them in. Okay. Now, I have a caveat for you. I want to make sure you understand this. We're talking mostly about federal aid that comes through the State Department of Transportation to the Local Programs Bureau. Okay. But there are other things out there, such as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA, that have provisions for direct local federal aid. And there are other projects like that that are out there. Okay. Again, I will mention that, but I just want you to be aware of the fact that we're focusing on aid going through the state. So when I say state role, if you're getting direct funds, that actually becomes your role as the recipient of the grant. So we'll mention that as we go through it. And some people will call the IIJA the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. I just like it because it gives me a good little character, and I date myself because I remember when these came out initially from the old schoolhouse rock, and now everybody who knows that has that song stuck in their head. So I apologize. No, not really. I've got the song stuck in my head too. Now, I will try to the best of my ability to not use too many acronyms like IIJA or BIL without telling you first what it stands for. But I will tell you right now, that is an issue, okay? We have acronyms galore when it comes to all of this federal aid stuff. In fact, in the handout, there's a whole page listed with a bunch of acronyms that are not filled out, and that's done on purpose. And the reason for that is that material that's out there, okay, is essentially Well, it's a way to learn. If you know that acronym, you're probably in pretty good shape and you know that material. So if you know all those acronyms on the page, you're going to be in great shape. So we'll have lots of handouts out there, okay, that we're going to be dealing with over the course of the day. If you open up your chat pod, you will see the handouts. There are links, but again, if you can't get to them, please let me know, okay, and I will show you what they look like real quick. Okay, so there's the overview handout, which has a whole bunch of links. I would absolutely tell you to download that and get those links. You just open the chat pod at the bottom left if you're looking for that. Um, we have some information on resources that are available, including things like the Federal Aid Essentials videos, and I've checked, they're all still active. So you may want to go through that. The local projects manual here in New York State. Um, there's that page of acronyms that you're going to be able to look at. We're going to talk about those during the course of the day. And then a couple of graphics, one that the state uses for their projects and one from the local programs bureau called the wheel. And that's also one of the handouts that we've got, the New York State DOT wheel for federal aid projects. Um, We'll be using those during the course of the day. So again, you want to download those. You want to read through them. They're really well done. The federal aid process wheel that the state put together is a really good way to review each of the steps, and we'll be using that during the course of the day. So keep that in mind. Okay, let me minimize that, get back to our stuff. And let's talk about federal projects and why this is so important to have this training. Now, these are data prior to COVID. We're still sort of dealing with some of the fallout from that break and everything. So I've got some projects after COVID, but in terms of the statistics, I don't have the best statistics since. But if you think about it, this is a 4-year cycle. So you can see, not counting uh, the projects that are done in New York City, there's about 150 projects a year. And I know there's some folks from New York City on here, and they get quite a few projects. But I just was sort of looking at it from the standpoint of, why do we do this Federal Aid 101 class? So there's 247 agencies. So you immediately start to see that, wait a second, there's 247 agencies, but in New York State, outside of New York City, there's over 1,580 local agencies. So that's an interesting issue to deal with. Okay. Now, if we look at the number of projects that people have done, counties, okay, there are 57 counties in New York State outside of New York City. 54 counties had projects during that period, most of them doing 3 or more. Okay, a few counties only did 1 project. And obviously then 3 counties did none. For cities, there's 62 cities. Okay, and most cities, about half the cities did a project, well, 18 actually, 3 or more. So they're getting pretty familiar when you've done 3 or more projects, but quite a few only did 1 or 2. And if you're a town, only 2 towns did 3 or more projects in that 4-year span. And there are 933 towns, and so there's 800 and plus towns that did no federal projects. So we're doing this to help review the process to make sure everybody's on the same page. And by the way, for the villages, the number is over 580. It's a little bit of a moving target. So if we look at it overall, okay, the number of projects the local governments have done, okay, is 151 have only done 1, 66 have done 2, 64 different agencies have done 3 or more, and 373 total projects with from 5 or more. So the idea is most of the projects are done by larger agencies. In fact, about 80%. Hey, the old 80-20 rule still works. So just so we're on the same page, and see how many projects you've done. How many federal aid projects have you completed? Now, if you work for the state and you're on the other side of the house, you can put in how many projects you've overseen as a local projects liaison. But again, just to get a sense of how many projects that you have seen. Okay. 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 So of the folks on here today, and we've got, by the way, if you're wondering, we have about 120 of you. A lot of you have done a lot of projects. And so I'm really hoping you guys can doing things. We should be in pretty good shape. But a lot of you have done none or one project. And if one project you did was pre-COVID, there's been some changes. So yeah, these are got a good audience here. I like it. Okay, good variety of things. Now, what kind of project did you do? So again, we're going to do this quite often. We're going to do these projects. And again, if you can't access the polls online through Poll EV, please feel free to put them into the Q&A. Okay? So what kind of projects have you done? Okay, a bridge replacement. Yeah. Okay. Preventive maintenance. Getting federal aid for that, that's usually challenging unless there's a safety component. Roadway construction. Okay. Some PSAP projects. Ooh, somebody used an acronym. Ooh. Culvert work. Yeah. Okay. We'll talk about the fact that some projects are actually state funded versus federal, and there are different standards. Safe Routes to School, an old program, and I see a whole bunch of folks using the Q&A with roundabouts and repairing bridges, trails, rails to trails, and we'll talk about those during the course of the day. Yeah. So again, there's a lot of aid out there. And again, over the course of the day, I want you to put any questions you've got, and I see a few folks have already put a few questions in here. Okay, and we will leave this active. So things such as best practices for working with state officials and pros and cons of public transportation, um, local road safety plans, things like that. So put them in, and we will be talking about these in the course of the day. We're going to be using sort of in your mind, there's tons of things you can do, but I want you to keep in mind two possible projects that we can talk about during the course of the day. One would be a safety related project, like maybe you're doing a proven countermeasure, or one might be a bridge rehab or replacement. Okay? I just want you to note before we go any further that I chose these two because they are always eligible for federal funds. You're competing with others, but you're always eligible if you're doing a safety improvement or you're doing a bridge work of a certain level, because safety is obviously the most critical thing. We want everybody to get home every day. And bridges, you start getting large spans, we want to make sure that there's funding available to keep those bridges in good shape. Okay? So if you've got a project in this area, you can sort of mentally walk through the process as we go through. Now, in terms of federal aid projects, there are lots of funds out there. Most of these are still active. Some of them have been slowed down, but again, you're going to need to look into those. But there's Rebuilding American Infrastructure, Sustainability and Equity. That one's been paused. There's Infrastructure for Rebuilding America. That one's still on. Safe Streets for Roads for All. That one's, there's an active grant out there. This is just a list of 5 grants of dozens that are out there. Okay? And funds are still being released under the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act. So in New York State, they're actually using some of those funds at the state level to reconnect communities to actually cover over, in this particular case, the highway that runs into Buffalo, the Kensington. Okay. Now, in this particular case, it's only about 5% of the overall project's billion-dollar price tag, but it can be really helpful to get a grant to help stretch your dollars and to help focus on things. And so you have to decide whether you want to get a federal grant or not. Now, what New York State uses for their projects is something they call the New York State DOT Project Development Process Map. Okay? I've included that in the handout because I'm going to read everybody's mind right now. I'm going to be a mind reader. Watch this. Everybody's thinking the exact same thing. You're all thinking the font is too small. I can't read it. And my thinking is, you're right. Don't try to read it. That's why I put the figure in the handout. Okay? You can look at the specifics. It's actually a pretty cool little document. It's sort of like a game of life for projects you could go through, though I don't think you'd have the little card with the pins in it moving around. But we can break it down. They use colors to do this, and if you're colorblind, I apologize, but they use colors. So the upper section is green, and that's the planning process. Then we go to focus on the scope. So we're going to have a scoping period where we figure out what we're actually going to do, and we're going to be doing that over the course of the day today. We're then going to be talking about the design itself, okay, and that's a process involved. You're going to build it, make sure it's been built properly, and then finally, you're actually going to go off of this chart to the operations and maintenance phase. But I want to make sure we think about that during the course of the day because you want to build something that you can maintain and operate that's not too expensive. Don't cinch yourself when you're building a project. Now, the Federal Highway Administration, they use a slightly different focus, okay? They use a project flowchart that looks slightly different. It's the same focus, except because their primary responsibilities are a little bit different, and we'll talk about those in a little bit, they are slightly different in terms of what they've got. By the way, I have an acronym. Somebody in the Q&A pod want to tell me what PS&E stands for? It's our first acronym that showed up on screen without. See if somebody in the Q&A wants to tell me what PS&E stands for. Plans, specifications, and estimates. Yeah, very good. Yeah, it's plans, specifications. That's essentially we're putting everything together. And we'll have preliminary ones, we'll have early ones, and we'll have the final ones that go with the design and contractual documents. So yeah, nice job. Okay. But you could take this exact same set of 4 areas, and even 5, and realize there's still a planning period, there's still a scoping period, there's still a design period. You're going to construct it, and then it goes off this chart after it's been signed off by the feds to operations and maintenance. And of course, we can look at this a third way, and that's this wheel that I talked about from the State Local Programs Bureau. And again, I know the font is too small. That's why we gave this to you, so you can look at it at your leisure later on. And again, if you're thinking about a federal project, I advise you to take that document and read through. It's not a hard read. It'll help you out so that as you're going through the steps, you'll be in pretty good shape. And what they've done is they've actually taken all of the steps and they've sort of broken them out. And I've made this big font so you can just all see it, from planning and identifying all the way back to the operations and maintenance phase at the end. Same concept: a planning period, a scoping period, a design period, a construction period, and then finally the operations and maintenance. Now you'll see there's a lot of steps. And the reason there's all these steps is the way the process is set up. We always ask ourselves, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Okay, and here were some chickens that were, by the way, actually crossing a road. I got a picture of them before they crossed the road, but they were actually crossing a road. Uh, but the question is, what comes first? Well, in this case, it's a reimbursement program. All federal dollars are reimbursement programs. So you spend the money up front and you get reimbursed based upon what you've done. So to go from one step to the next, you have to get authorization. Do not go to the next step until you got the authorization, because you have the risk of having the funds not available if you move forward. Okay, so there's a process involved. So that's why there's all those steps. A lot of them are pretty quick, but I just want you to be aware of that fact. Now, in terms of how the reimbursement works, how much do you have to carry as a local agency? Well, let's think about it this way. We have the contractor, we have the sponsor, we have the New York State DOT. And again, as I said, these are for projects going through DOT. If you're the direct recipient from US DOT or Federal Highway Administration, in this case, you would actually just be taking that step yourself. Okay? But what's going to happen is the contractor is going to perform the work. Okay? When they perform the work, they're going to submit a bill to you as the sponsor, the local agency. Well, you're going to then turn around and say, yep, that work was done properly. You're going to submit a voucher to the state, and the state then is going to, in turn, ask the feds to reimburse. Okay? Now, it's not, you don't have to wait till the Federal Highway Administration supports it to get the money, because the contractor performs the work, submits an invoice, you pay the contractor. There's a time frame involved for that. Okay? And we'll talk about that time frame. You're then going to immediately turn around and do a reimbursement request to DOT, and they're going to pay you, again, in a fairly quick time frame. Then DOT is going to do a reimbursement request to Federal Highway, and they're going to get reimbursed. The DOT is. Contractors long been paid. Subcontractors have long been paid. But the idea is there's a process for each step. Okay? So I just want you to be aware that you do need to carry things forward, and don't move forward until you've got the authorization to go from step to step to step. So for our Federal Aid 101 today, we're going to be doing project steps, and I'm going to break it down. We're going to have a planning period, a scoping period, design, construction. And I want to finish, before we get to the Q&A, with operations and maintenance issues, because that actually should be part of your initial planning process. What are you going to be able to operate and maintain? And we're going to be using sort of a combination. We're going to talk about where we fit on the project development process or on the wheel that's available from local programs. Okay. Now, I mentioned earlier, Federal Highway's role is really is oversight. Their job is to make sure things are compliant. We'll talk about specifically what that role is in a minute. But just what do you think? Knowing nothing, and that's good. Some of you, of course, have lots of projects under your belt, so you probably can answer this. What would be some key program elements for an oversight agency like the Federal Highway Administration? What do you think? Let's see what y'all put in there, and then we'll talk about those key program elements. Budget, yep. Safety, quality assurance, administration, accountability, scope, schedule, documentation. What's the phasing of the project? Ooh, some pretty good answers here. Compliance with the rules, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Again, a good variety of answers. I like it. Okay. Is it a WBE, We'll talk about that more. Minority business enterprise or disadvantaged business enterprises. Okay. So environmental issues, yeah, you're hitting most of the targets. The list we got from Federal Highway, all of this we got through Federal Highway and DOT, list these areas. So there's the reimbursement process, there's the steps for the authorizations. What project costs are eligible? You know, if you're doing a safety project, you can't use that to do paving unless that paving has a safety component. So they check to make sure things are eligible. They make sure that the planning process has been followed. Someone mentioned environment. Absolutely, that's important. Right of way, we will talk a lot about right of way because that's critical. The administration of the process, are there special projects or steps that have to be taken? And they're, of course, going to be doing some audits possibly. DOT will do some as well, but it is actually a requirement for Federal Highway to do a certain amount of audits. So let's get started with our project. So what's the first step in a project? Well, we could decide on lots of them, but I think the first step I would have anybody do before you go any further is you have to look for two things. The first one is you have to have what's known as a unique entity identifier, UEI. Okay? Used to be called a DUNS, used to be a DUNS number. Now they've switched it to the UEI. It takes about 3 to 8 weeks to get one of these numbers. So if you're thinking about going and getting a grant, go get a UEI. Most governments have one, but if you don't have one, you can go get one, and you can find it either by going on to the sam.gov, yes, UncleSam.gov, or grants.gov. These are federal sites where you can look for grants too at the same time. Okay? Now, I told you earlier I was going to ask you to raise your hand. Please raise your hand if you have a UEI and you know you have a UEI. Let's see how many of you are pretty confident that you've got one. Okay. I know Cornell has one. Okay. So if you didn't raise your hand, and a lot of you didn't, uh, you want to make sure you have that because you're going to need that to be able to move the process forward. Okay. Now, the other thing you're going to be doing, you're going to look for, and we'll talk about where some of these might be. You're going to be looking for the what is called the NOFO. You hear NOFO all the time. It's the Notice of Funding Opportunity. Okay, it's again one of those dangerous acronyms that we deal with. And we'll be talking about sources of funds that are out there over the course of the day. Okay. Now, we're going to start with our project, but what I want to make sure we're on the same page on is what are everybody's roles and responsibilities? What is your job? Okay. Federal, state DOT, and the sponsor, i.e. local agency in this particular case. It could be an MPO, by the way. It could be a metropolitan planning organization. Okay. Almost got myself doing an acronym without telling what it means. Okay. Cost me a quarter. Okay, so let's talk about everybody's responsibilities. We'll start with the Federal Highway Administration. Um, I'm going to read something. I don't normally like to put this much text on here, but yeah, you like those rolls? Yeah, those are rolls my wife made. You can tell my pictures because they're fuzzy on the edge. Yeah, she made those. They're pretty good. Apple. She cut apple into them. They're really good. Okay, so DOT. The job of the DOT at the federal level, the Federal Highway Administration, is to ensure recipients of federal aid deliver the program, which includes project delivery, in an efficient, effective, and compliant manner with federal requirements. Okay? So I want you to understand that's the key here. Okay, they have three primary responsibilities, and we'll see if my good old pen works today. And it is. So it's efficient, it's effective, and it's compliant. Okay, and those standards, as you probably can guess, do change over time. What counts as compliant? What counts as efficient? What counts as effective? And I will tell you right now, Chris hasn't joined us yet, but he will join us later from Federal Highway. I guarantee you, if you ask him up front, he will admit there are times when it is hard to balance all three of those. And it sometimes feels like, and we've all dealt with this, that the only thing they care about is compliance. And they're not worried about efficiency and effectiveness. The problem is all three are there. So that's the balancing act. So when you get frustrated, and I'll admit, I sometimes get frustrated when we deal with agencies, and by the way, this is my own university, when we seem to be more focused on the compliance. But it's because we have to look at all three because they're all important. And we'll talk about why as we go through the course of the day. Now, the roles for the division level, that's the state level office in Albany, is to administer the federal aid program within the state. They also do provide technical assistance, though most of that technical assistance is through the DOT unless it's a direct recipient project. And so that means they're going to be working with DOT on local projects, and they will review and approve what is known as the Local Projects Manual, or LPM. Okay? And so that's the state procedures and projects. And yes, you don't have to memorize these things. It's linked in the handout. They will be conducting reviews, especially when it comes to stewardship and oversight, and making sure that things are spent in an efficient, effective, and compliant way. Okay? Now, to do this, they use what's called the area engineer. Okay. And I don't know what the current number is, but I know New York State has 8 area engineers when they're fully staffed. I know they're not currently fully staffed. So that means that a person who's an area engineer might be covering 2 different areas, which of course takes more time. So if we can do a good job with our paperwork, it can help them for the oversight because they're the primary contact. They're focused on risk, financial risk, safety risk, risk issues of all type, liabilities. Um, they have, by their nature, they have to be procedures focused. Okay, they can get into engineering focused stuff at Federal Highway, but the area engineers are focused mainly on the procedures, and they need to maintain awareness of the project status. So make sure you keep in good communications, or that your liaison at the state level is doing so. They're not generally validating any technical or computational aspects unless you specifically ask for help to do that. And you can do that if need be, if you're concerned. Okay. Now, in terms of project involvement, um, again, it's through the division, and they've updated their process. It's still changing. Now, you may have, if you've done projects, more than 3 or 4 years ago, you probably thought, well, there's a category system that they used where they would classify things by their risk level. It's not done that way anymore completely. It's still a risk-based approach, okay? But that comes down to the stewardship and oversight plan. And what they're doing is looking at individual assessments, and they're reviewing those individual assessments, okay? So they're more project specific in that particular case, okay? Now, if need be, they can do a specific plan, but they're usually using a general oversight plan that exists. And that plan, again, can be project specific. It may involve additional oversight activities and approvals from Federal Highway, especially at the engineering level or risk level, especially at the financial risk. Okay. So there, you're going to come across different documents they've got. So the Compliance Assessment Program or the Financial Integrity Review and Evaluation. Yes, acronym is FIRE and CAP. Okay. Essentially, these are programs in place to make sure that A, complying with the process, CAP, and to make sure there's a financial integrity. Can the local agency afford and carry the cash to do the project? That's actually pretty important. Okay. So keep that in mind. Okay. So just something to be aware of. And they will be doing process reviews. They will be doing program element reviews. What I would say here is, don't go too worried about it. They're involved. They're looking things over, but more than anything else, their job is to sort of help make sure people don't miss things. Okay? That really is their primary job, that people don't miss things. And of course, they're doing lots of tasks as well. Now, where does all this fit within federal aid? Um, there's different ways to do this. I'm going to show you one method that this is the way the feds think about it. You think about the standpoint of everything starts with the laws, and underneath that you have regulations. You can have policies that follow that regulation. You may get some guidance documents, and of course, there's tons and tons of information. So, from a amount of material that's prepared, this is probably the right way to look at federal aid requirements because of the amount of things that are you have to review. Okay, so as an example, you might have the IIJA as the law. There might be code regulations that go with that, such as Titles 23 and 49. There might be policies that are administered and guidance like that wheel and the documents in the local programs manual. And then, of course, all the information that goes with the contract. You can look at it a different way, and this is the way I think about it. And again, neither way is right or wrong, but I look at it from the standpoint of building a foundation, as I am a geotechnical engineer partially too, and that is so the foundation, of course, is the Constitution and the law. And everything gets built off of that with regulations, policies, and things like that. Okay? Now, guidance or contracts are going to be in place by the time you're all said and done. So let's just go through an example just to illustrate. So we have our Constitution, we have laws. This is the oldest one I could find for New York State for highway laws, for instance. They come into play. Okay? Now, the laws might come down to vehicle and traffic law, but there might be a regulation that goes with that, such as the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices. And remember, when there's a regulation, there might be a federal or national regulation, as in the MUTCD, another acronym, but state can have an additional requirement. Like, for instance, they have a supplement here in New York State. Now, a local agency might have a policy on top of that. So, for instance, a lot of local agencies don't put up children at play zones, even though they're allowed in the New York State supplement. And of course, you may get guidance. We produce a guide called the Traffic Sign Handbook. That guidance is not in the force of law or policy, but it can help someone through the process. Okay, but underneath it is the policy and the regulations. And of course, if there's an agreement or a contract, that has to meet the requirements of everything else. But that's where we actually follow through when we sign things and everybody's on the same page. Okay. Now, what is the role of the DOT? Okay. Well, the role of the DOT is to essentially look at the whole federal aid process or oversight. Okay, so when a project is submitted, they recommend, hey, yep, this project meets the requirements for eligibility for federal aid. They're reviewing things to make sure you're compliant with both state and federal requirements because their goal is to protect the investment, the money that comes from the state. So they're trying to protect that investment. They're also trying to protect local investments too. They don't want folks to spend money and wind up having something that doesn't do anything. And they do this via the local projects manual. And again, that's linked. You don't have to memorize any of this. They do provide technical assistance at the regional level, at the regional offices. Okay. And so the specific person you want to know at the regional office is the RLPL. You will hear that acronym a lot when you start getting into projects. And again, because I don't want to give you too many acronyms, that is the Regional Local Project Liaison. Okay? So, I'm going to ask you to raise your hands again. Do you know your RLPL in your region? Raise your hand. If you're with an engineering firm, you might know more than one, but you should know at least one. And again, let's see how many of you raise your hand. If you're an RLPL, you can go ahead and raise your hand. You know yourself. At least I hope you do. Okay. So quite a few of you do. As you get into projects, you will absolutely want to know the RLPL. You're going to want to pick up the phone and talk to them. Okay? And if you are working in the tribal world, there may be a tribal liaison. You're going to have somebody you talk to. That's absolutely critical because they're going to be helping you interpret the manuals and the guidelines. They're going to help you with monitoring the projects to make sure everything is complete. They're your direct contact with the main office in Federal Highway Administration. So you don't have to know all of those folks. They can do that for you. Any local project agreements, they're going to be signing off on it. Okay. And so you're going to have periodic meetings with them. Some are required, but hey, pick up the phone. All of the folks I've talked to who are RLPLs will tell you communication is key to successful projects because there's a lot of stuff out there, and not everybody's going to be able to go on up to Albany and talk to the folks at the local programs bureau. Okay? So that's where, they've got a lot of folks. In fact, we'll be joined this afternoon by a couple of folks from the bureau to answer some of the questions that you might have about the process. Okay, so let's go start building our project. We've started to plan and identify things. We're getting ready to do this. We have all these steps. Each of these steps requires an approval. What do you think are some examples of the kind of things that DOT is going to approve during the project? What do you think DOT, where are they going to sign off so you can go from step to step to step? Think about that for a sec. They're going to approve plans. Yep. They're going to, okay, permits. Yep. As-built, towards the end of the process. Yeah. NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, design reports. They're going to actually review the initial applications. Yeah. Payments. Oh, absolutely. Somebody put over in the Q&A, patients. Right-of-ways and right-of-way incidentals. Yeah. You can think about all the things. They're essentially approving each step in the process. They're concurring with anything that you've done locally. They're making sure you've done good faith efforts or that you've got your requirements met for the disadvantaged business process. Okay? So they're going to be involved in all of these steps. That's why it's so important to get to know the folks at the RLP at the state level. Okay? And yes, the PS&E, the estimates. Okay. So you, the local agency, so what requirements and roles do you have? Well, first off, you need to have somebody who essentially is the person who signed off that says, we're going to get this project done. That is the responsible local official. That's usually a town supervisor at the town level. It might be somebody in the elected board at the county level. It's probably a mayor at a city or village level. This is a local official, someone who's taken an oath of office who can do this, okay? It is possible in some cases for a county highway official or a town official, but normally because of the financial stuff, it usually needs to be a board person who does this, okay? Because it's a financial certification as much as an engineering one. You're going to need to have a project manager, okay? That project manager oversees the project at the local level. They need to be a full-time employee of the agency, okay? You can't hire somebody part-time. It's a full-time employee. Now, they are probably going to be doing more than one project, but it's a project manager. We'll come back to that in a little bit, that role. It's so important. I want to talk about a bit more. The engineer in charge or resident engineer might be out on the site. That a lot of times be a consultant. It could be a staff person, staff engineer to do that. You're going to be having inspectors that you're hiring. Generally, you bring those from outside in. You want independent inspections, okay? But you're going to be bringing all of these people into your particular project. Now, the project manager. That project manager is full-time. That's a pretty important role because that person needs to be overseeing both the financial side and the engineering side of the house. They may not be an engineer, but they need to be able to understand the process enough to make sure everything's moving forward. Okay? So you want to make sure you've got a person who's working for you that sees your interest first. That's why they need to be a full-time employee. Okay? If you hire somebody from outside, their focus may not be first for the agency. So you really want somebody working for you, and that is a requirement. They're full-time. Okay? Now, you're going to have a pre-construction meeting before you get started with the process. Okay? You're going to host that. That's done via that project manager. They're going to make sure they've got qualified inspection staff, ensure compliance with all of the standards, and sign off on any change orders. Yes, the state's going to be approving those change orders as well, but obviously the better you do at the change order side, the better off it's going to be, quicker it's going to be for review and process. And at the end of the process, they complete the closeout and the project is done. Yay, we're good. Okay. Now, One of the things I want you to keep in mind, if you're going to become a project manager or if you're the engineer in charge, I want you to remember there are still federal requirements not associated with federal aid that have to be met, whether you're getting federal aid or not. They come up in the federal aid process, but they have to be met on any project. So Title VI, non-discrimination, the Americans with Disabilities Act, those have to be met, and they are discussed in the Local Projects Manual, Chapter 13 on civil rights. Okay? And yes, I know there's some changes coming out there, so you need to be aware of those changes. If you're doing a bridge project and it's a scour critical bridge, that's a separate requirement that you have to meet. Okay? So keep that in mind. Yeah, CFR 200, there's lots of different chapters. You still have to meet things, even if you're not getting federal aid. You have to have ADA requirements. Those have to be met no matter what. Okay? So there are some changes. There's been a pullback maybe a little bit on what's known as PROWAG, the right-of-way access guide that's out there. But you still need to meet the ADA. You still need to at least think about whether or not you've got good transitions for not just wheelchairs, but anybody who's got an ADA issue. Americans with Disabilities Act, by the way, is the acronym. We don't want things like this. You spend all the money to put in some sidewalks, and then you forget about the fact that what's that wheelchair going to do when they get across the street? Okay? So everybody has their role to play, and I want you to just be aware of that and make sure they have their role. And in terms of overseeing everything, you're going to want to make sure you are comfortable with all of that, the whole process. So as we go through today and we talk about everything, I want you to feel comfortable asking questions and knowing who your RLPL is, your Regional Local Projects Liaison. Okay? Now, let's see, anything over in the Q&A? Someone asked, there's a note about prevailing wage. We will talk about prevailing wage. I promise you that. That'll come up quite often. Okay. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead. We're going to go and talk about planning. Okay. Now, planning is chapters 2, 3, and 4 in the Local Projects Manual on project initiation and management, some funding stuff. We're going to review again some of the roles and responsibilities and the state-local agreements issue. In terms of the big wheel, this is where we're first going to plan and identify our project, and we're going to get our funding. Okay? Now, step 1, plan and identify the project. Could be our safety project. Maybe it's through the HSIP. And so things like that. And it could be a bridge project where you're dealing with rehab or replacing a bridge. Okay? Now, before we go to my next poll question, someone put over in the Q&A, how did PROWAG simplify ADA compliance? PROWAG is a document that was prepared to talk about how to meet ADA compliance within the public right-of-way. That's what the P in the PROWAG stands for, okay? Because there's definitely a difference between when you're putting in a building versus in a public right-of-way, because if you're on a really steep roadway, as an example, you can't meet the grades for someone in a wheelchair. You can't necessarily meet the grades for someone who's using a walker that you would have to meet when it comes to a building. And so they were trying to figure out how do you balance that reality, okay? So we're going to be talking about that as we go through the day. We'll come back to ADA in a little bit. So now we're going to talk about plan and identify the project. And yes, someone says in the Q&A, shouldn't it be identify and then plan? Well, yeah, we could argue that, but I'm using the descriptions that are in the wheel. Plan and identify sort of go hand in hand, okay? So we need to make sure we have a project, and this is sort of the macro level plan. This isn't a detailed scoping activity. This is more of a, we need to do some bridge work, we need to do a safety plan. Now, for your own internal projects, things you're doing in-house, how long does it take you to go from project inception to construction? Okay? If you are not getting a grant, if you were doing this completely in-house, how long? And we're going to talk, I do want to talk about, capital level type projects. We're not talking about chip seal. We're talking about something like a major sidewalk repair, update of a shoulder and a curve, doing major deck replacement on a bridge. How long does it take you? Okay? And so on the Q&A on the pod, we're seeing 3 to 4 years, a couple of folks, 1 to 2. Yeah. Most of you say 3 to 4 years. Okay. A lot of you did say 1 to 2, and a few of you do it less, and a few of you do it more. Bell curve. Cool. The key here is we need to be thinking about projects long term, and yet at the same time, remember, when a grant comes out, it might be 6 to 8 weeks where you've got to get the grant prepared. So you have to balance those two things and understand the notice of funding that's out there. Okay. That funding opportunity may come along quick, and if it's taking you 3 to 4 years, you may need to have a few projects ready to go because depending on how the notice is written, you might have to spend it within a year or two. Other projects you can go longer, and you need to understand that when you read the notice of funding opportunity. So when it comes to planning projects, eventually you need to get things on a master plan. So there is a state long-range plan for projects, okay? Each metropolitan planning organization has a plan, and there are 14 MPOs statewide. We'll show a map of them in a little bit. There are going to be regional transportation plans that may exist that cross over municipal boundaries or when there isn't an MPO. So you may need to be involved with that. All of these eventually do have to get put on, if there's federal aid involved, something known as the Transportation Improvement Plan or the State Transportation Improvement Plan. Okay? It has to be on there eventually to get the federal funds. And they can be done quick. I mean, when they did some of the Bridge New York projects, the turnaround on those is very, very quick. They can add them in. It's not a complicated process, but it does need to be on there. Now, here is the map of the metropolitan planning organizations here in New York State. Raise your hand if you are in an MPO. Raise your hand if you're inside. If you where you are right now is inside an MPO. Now, I could probably guess what that number should be based on where you clicked on the map earlier, but I'm betting some of you aren't going to answer because we have the American democratic system. And I'm right, because most of you were inside of an MPO. If you're in Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Ithaca, Elmira, Binghamton, Albany, Saratoga Springs, most of downstate, including all of Long Island, Utica, and Watertown, you are in an MPO. Okay, so most of you actually probably are. Okay, and if you are inside one of those areas, if your project is involved in one of those areas, you may need to go through the Metropolitan Planning Organization. Okay, now you're thinking about a project. Okay, every project that's out there that's federal highway is going to have a description based on it. Okay, so what do you think should be in every project description? Okay, so as you start developing everything that you need to do for a project, what do you think you have to include? Well, the location. Yeah, that's probably pretty important. Yeah, yeah. What are you doing? What's the purpose? You're going to get assigned, someone put it over in the Q&A, you're going to get assigned a project identification number. Yeah, there'll be a number assigned to it eventually. You're going to need a scope, you're going to need schedules, you're going to need budgets. Yep. Okay, let's see. You got right-of-way issues. We'll get back to right-of-way. Surprisingly, that may not be at the beginning, but you're definitely going to get involved there. Purpose and need. Yeah, project objective, it's sometimes called. The description of the project itself. What elements are you looking at or project type? Is it a bridge? Is it a safety issue? Is it a capacity problem? Which would be sort of the work scope tasks that somebody mentioned. I'm looking for 2 or 3 things that I don't see yet. They're pretty important. What are the limits for the work? Yep. The need. Okay. You're going to want to think about a schedule. Okay. That eventually you're going to be putting into a long-term project management plan. Obviously, that means you're going to have some cost information that goes with it. Very good. Um, you need to figure out where the source of funding is. There we go, budget. You need to think about who's paying the bill. Is it local money? How much local money? How much cash do you have to carry until you can get reimbursed? So again, what's the funding source? Things like that. Okay. And somebody put into the Q&A, I thought something very important. It's not in the project description, but it is the idea. You got to get public involvement. And we'll talk about public involvement. There's some things that are required and some that are just good ideas. Okay. So I would start making a list of the projects. Every project eventually will get assigned a project title and description. For instance, Route 6 over Sagawau Creek, or Route 9 between point A and point B. Okay, there'll be a title and description of what's being done. It will get assigned what's known as a PIN, project identification number. If it involves a bridge, the bridge identification number will get attached to it, and then where it's located, the village, town, or city in whatever county is involved. Okay. Obviously, it could have more than one municipality. That's perfectly allowed, but again, that's all going to be done, and that will be now tied to every single report that you put out there. Now, before we go any further, though, we have to create a good estimate of the project. And the cost is probably the single most important thing. We're going to revisit this when we talk about scoping, okay? But I want you to think about making sure you have a good estimate. In other words, to the best of your ability, and trust me, it's not always easy, but to the best of your ability, I want you to build the entire project on paper before you go out for federal aid. Okay? That means you're going to be thinking about the preliminary design, the right-of-way issues, property acquisitions, construction, the inspection, the miscellaneous, and that also will lead you to the idea of what am I going to have to do with my own funds later to maintain it. I'd much rather you spend a little bit more now and get a project that doesn't cost as much maintenance-wise, and that might be good engineering economics. You'll have to think about that. But you need to have a good cost estimate. And do me a favor, don't think, oh, boy, I can't, if I ask for more money, I won't get it. No, 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 no. Include everything unless there is a specific limit in the notice of funding opportunity, the NOFO, unless it specifically says you can't go above a certain amount. Include everything. You don't want to shortchange yourself. If you ask for $500,000 when you really needed $1 million, and you go back and you go, I could use another $500,000, that might say no. It's a constrained process. The State Transportation Improvement Plan is constrained, and you may not be able to get those additional funds. You might, but boy, you might not. So make sure you include everything. So let's just ask, okay, what should be included in the cost estimate for a project? And again, you can think about this as if it were a bridge project or if this was a safety project. But what should be, yeah, cost of inspection. You can get paid for inspection. The cost of developing the plans. You might want a contingency amount on there. Right of way. You have to have right of way. And we'll talk about that quite a bit as we go through the course of the day. The cost of design, the cost of the materials, the engineering. Okay? Someone put in Q&A, A to Z. Okay? What I think you should think about doing is just take a piece of paper or a whiteboard and start writing down all of the things. We're going to do an exercise for that after our break. You really want to make sure you don't miss something, okay? Now, you do want to be careful you don't get scope creep. We'll talk about that more as well. But think about everything there. Do you have the money to pay for the design, the incidentals, the right-of-way, the construction inspection, any miscellaneous work? The cost of, you've got contingency, the cost of time, okay? Remember, everything is constrained, so you want a good estimate going in. And so what you're going to be doing and you start developing your project is you're going to have a project management plan, a PMP. PMP is not what used to be sold here on campus at Cornell called the Poor Man's Pizza, which is a pizza on a French bread. No, this is a project management plan. And it's a fairly simple process. There's actually example project management plans that are in the handout materials through the local programs manual. You can walk through, it won't take you long. As you're developing your project management plan, you're originally going to start with something that's called an initial project proposal. It's essentially a short version of that longer, more detailed plan that you're going to need later on. Because eventually you're going to have a comprehensive plan that includes your milestones, your cost, things to make sure the controls don't go out of hand, and who's got what roles, responsibilities. Now, New York State does have something known as a smart growth screening tool that you're going to need to fill out. Again, this is an example of something that it is an additional step. I understand. You're thinking, another step. The good news is they developed a tool. You just need to go through the tool and fill it out. This is not something that's going to be super, super complicated. And it's part of the New York State Smart Growth Public Infrastructure Policy Act. And yes, it has an acronym, but that particular one I didn't include because it's so specific. And it's been around since 2010, if you're wondering. But there's a tool, again, there's checklists where you don't miss filling out the smart growth screening tool. They just want to make sure that we're not putting things that have become a white elephant, is really the goal with the particular thing. Now, our next step is to go get project funding. Okay? Now, I actually think scoping is important, but again, we'll come back to why scoping is where it is in the process. We'll come back to that later. But I'm also a firm believer the mind can absorb what can endure. It is just about 10:30. Okay? So we are just about 1 hour in. So we're going to give you your first break. Okay? And I'm going to write down the slide number so I don't forget what slide I need to go to. And we'll see you in, we said 15 minutes. And I'm going to see if this technology works. Boop. And we're going to be back at 10:45. I got to change the color so you can see it. So everybody enjoy your 15 minutes. Go check your email. Smoke them if you got them, though we should probably all not smoke. And I will see y'all at 10:45. Okay, we'll be starting up here in about another 30 seconds. Again, last chance to put in your questions because we'll be doing some new polls here. That poll will get deactivated for a little bit. But again, make sure it's active at every break so you can keep putting your questions in for the Q&A this afternoon. And we do have an addition, Anna Price from Federal Highway will be joining us as well. Okay. Now let's see if my magic worked here. Magic fingers. The trick on PowerPoint, if you know the slide number, you type it in, hit enter, it takes you to the right slide. Cool trick. Okay, so hope everybody had a good break, got through your emails, and there was no crisis. And mostly you could get to do what my wife likes to tell me to do, and that is delete, delete, delete. But who knows? So what I want to do now is obtain project funding. And yes, I know the order may be not perfect, but I'm trying to follow the wheel. I think that wheel document is valuable enough as a good way to help you guide through the process. I want to follow it, and you can read through this later on. I will tell you right now, I still think it's a good idea before you actually apply to have walked through the entire wheel and thought about all of those steps. And the steps we're about to go through for obtaining funding and scoping are absolutely critical steps before you apply for anything. Okay? So we're going to go and remember, we're doing federal projects. And so we're funding the federal aid and our friend Bill here. Okay? You know, again, I've got that song stuck in my head. It's gonna be all day. It always happens. But there's the Infrastructure Investments and Job Acts. There's Safe Streets and Roads for All, or SS4A. There's the State Transportation Plan, Surface Transportation Plan. Excuse me. There are tons of things out there. TAP, which stands for I wrote it down. Transportation Alternatives Program. There's a Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement Program, which goes by the nickname CMAQ, spelled with a Q but pronounced with a K. Bridge New York, which we'll come back to Bridge New York a little bit, but Bridge New York, remember, if it's a bridge, it's federal dollars. If it's culverts under that program, that's actually state dollars, and it's not part of what we're talking about, though you're still following similar processes. And then, of course, there's the Highway Safety Improvement Program, and that's one of the grants that's out right now, okay? So SS4A and HSIP are out right now. But before we apply for a project, we need to know if we're eligible. And again, that will be described in the NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity. But just in general, let's just see how we can think about this. What would be federally eligible on this list? Bridge replacement on a local road, new sidewalks to a school, rehab of a low volume road, safety improvements at an intersection, signal replacement at the mall. Which of these would be eligible? I'm not saying you're going to win the grant. It's it's a competitive program, but I am going to tell you which ones would be eligible. Okay? Now, one of the weird things, every polling software has a weird quirk. In this particular case, the weird quirk is while you're allowed to mark as many as you want, it shows me percentages based upon only 100%. So it's one of those weird quirks. But most of you are putting down bridges. Yeah. A bridge, remember, as I said, is always eligible. Again, you were competing with other bridges, but it's always eligible. You might want to bundle your projects together. And I see somebody put in the Q&A, all five. Well, sidewalks to school, that's a safety improvement. Again, probably is, but you need to show that it's a safety improvement, not just a wouldn't it be nice, a WIMBY. Um, Rehab of a low volume road, it's going to be, unless there's something specifically in there that's got a safety component to it, or there was a specific notice of funding for that, most of the time a rehab, probably not, especially if it's less than a rehab. If it's just maintenance, absolutely. That's going to be local dollars. Safety improvements in an intersection, that should have been 100% of you. Again, if it's a safety improvement, especially if it's a proven countermeasure, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute, yeah, that's going to be eligible. You may be competing with others, but it's eligible on all roads. Public roads are available. Now, as for the signal replacement at the mall, it might be eligible, but you might actually say to the mall owner, hey, you need to upgrade that signal as part of your mall work. But it might be able to be used as part of an overall safety improvement. Like, for instance, you're doing a corridor and you're trying to get all the lights to be timed together. That could be considered a safety or capacity improvement, and the notice of funding might be eligible. The key is go seek funding and make sure you've read the notice of funding opportunity and make sure you understand it, the timing, ask the right questions. There's almost always a webinar that goes with these things. Go to the webinar and listen, make notes, ask questions. And before you get done, you want to have a realistic timing and budget. That's absolutely key to doing the process. So you know, hey, we're going to have to cover this ourselves, or we're going to have to be spending upfront funds until we get reimbursed. A realistic timing and budget is absolutely critical. Now, one of the ones that is out right now, one of the two, there's one through the Safe Streets for All. That's a safety grant. That's a direct funding one. But I want to talk a little bit about the one that's through state DOT right now. This is part of the Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan. There's a call for funds. It officially goes through the Highway Safety Improvement Program, or HSIP. Okay? These particular funds are only eligible if you're on a local road, so county, city, or village. And the good news is there's $90 billion. In fact, I'm suspicious that that's why there's 127 of you sitting on the webinar right now. I could be wrong, but I don't think so. They set aside 10 million of that for developing local road safety plans. We had a whole series of webinars we've done on this. They're all recorded and available on our website. You can just search for them. There's also links within the handout to all the materials you'd need to apply. They are due in just a few weeks. So June 13th is the current deadline date. So this will be useful for our friends Robert and Andrew from the state DOT who have joined us. Let's just see. What is your plans? Are you planning on? Let me clear the responses on this one. I added this morning. I forgot to clear these. Let me clear them. There we go. Are you planning to put in for the new grant? So I'm going to just put in for local road safety plans. I'm going to implement a countermeasure. I'm not sure or no. You can pick any of these or all of them if you want. In this case, I turned it to a counter. Okay? And again, there's 127 of you, so we should get quite a few votes. If you're not sure, go ahead and say it. I'd rather know, and I think it's useful for the state to know who might be applying. Okay? Because I can tell you right now, if only 5 of you are applying for local road safety plans or implementation of countermeasures, you're going to be really happy if you just do a good job on your application, because your competition level is going to be low. So absolutely something to think about. My suggestion to you, especially for this first round coming out right now, put in an application. If you do not have a local road safety plan, absolutely try to get one for your community, whether it's grouped as a whole county at a level, which is probably a good way to do it, or through your MPO, get a plan in place. There's about a dozen of them I know of across the state. Tompkins County, Ithaca just released theirs literally 2 days ago, yesterday. I got the preliminary because I was on the advisory committee, but I think it was officially released, might have been yesterday. There was a news article about it, so it's out. You definitely want to have a local road safety plan because if you're getting those federal funds directly, you have to have a plan in place before you apply for those. So, okay. Well, that's useful to know. Thank you. Now, when you do a federal project, you're going to be having an agreement. You're going to be executing a project agreement. This is called by two different names, and it's one of those cases where the acronym doesn't match the title. Okay? It's called the Federal Aid Local Project Agreement, but most people think of them as an SLA or state local agreement. And the reason for this is it's through the state DOT. So that's why this S is in there, not an F. Okay, so it's a state local agreement. It's in the local projects manual in chapter 4. And this is between you and the state DOT. Okay. Now, the idea is it's different agreements. Okay. There's a terminology you're going to have for each phase of your project. You may have a separate agreement. So you're going to have a schedule, which is the project phase, and the funding and deposits and things like that. You're going to have a Schedule B, which decides who's doing what. And then you're going to have a resolution by the local board obligating the funding and designated who is the responsible local official. So before you can accept the funds, the board has to accept that the project is going to be done and obligates the funding, and they do this through a resolution by the board. Okay, so the board has to be involved, and that's where they're going to designate the person who's signing off. Again, at a village level, it's probably the mayor. Town level, it's the town supervisor. County level, it's somebody in the legislature typically. Okay, so you're going to have that resolution that's going to adopt everything, and then there's going to be a process. You're going to take that agreement, okay? You're going to approve it through your resolution, and you're going to send it to the state DOT at the regional level. This is where the RLPLs, those regional local projects liaisons, come involved. Okay, they're going to look it over. They're going to make sure it meets all the requirements. So before they send it on, they're going to help you not miss something. Now, a copy will be sent to the Federal Highway Administration, but this is more like a sidebar. This is not their approval. They're just giving FHW a chance to look it over, okay? So they can get it into what's known as the Federal Management System, or FEMAS, okay? But it's actually being approved through the DOT, okay? Just want you to be aware of the fact it's just really the side steps. Give them a chance. It doesn't physically go to them for approval. It's just something that they get a chance to look it over. And they might look and go and help out if they see something, if they have time. It's then going to go up to the main office in Albany for DOT. They're going to check it over, make sure it's in good shape. And then finally, of course, because it is a contract, it's an agreement, it has to go to the AG's office, the Attorney General's office, and the comptroller. And of course, once that's signed off, copies will go to everybody. And specifically, it's going to come back to you as a sponsor. Now, I will tell you right now, this is the model. It's only a model, like our friends with the model of the castle there. Uh, there may be slight tweaks. There may be times when the regional people uh, you know, step out of this just slightly. This is just to get you a sense of who's involved in the process. The key I want you to remember, if I had to take home anything from this process, is this is one of those places where you stop and you got to wait. And I know it's agonizing to wait, but no authorization could mean no reimbursement. So don't move on. Don't tell that design engineer to start going, because it's possible you could get them going, what? You worked outside of the agreement, so we're not going to pay you. Try not to do that. It doesn't happen often, and we'll talk about that process and all. They want to get you your funds, but it is possible you can get no reimbursement. So don't go forward. Just be patient. It can be hard, I know, especially when the weather's good. So maybe the rain will help. Okay, that's the planning process. But I can tell you right now, this is actually the second thing I would do. I've go through the whole thing. I think scoping is key. Okay, so let's spend some time on scoping. Because what we don't want is a flood of things coming our way that we're not ready for. So you really want to scope the project out, okay? If you're wondering, by the way, this is up on the Racket River just south of Malone. Oh, no, excuse me, Potsdam. Just south of Potsdam this spring, and it was flowing. And it's the same thing with a project. Once that project gets moving, it's got a lot of force behind it. So you want to have a good scope that everybody's on the same page. And where does this fit? Well, in the wheel, it's just one little step, hiring a consultant. But long before you hire a consultant, you're going to be doing a lot of other things. So let's do a little scoping project. We're going to do a project exercise or two. We're actually going to do two of them here. Okay. Again, we could do a bridge project. We could do a safety project. But we're going to do a project exercise. And what I want to do is I want to go through all 5 steps of planning, scoping, design, construction, and operations and maintenance. Okay, we're going to walk through the steps. You can do this on anything, by the way. Okay. What we're going to do is we're not going to do it on a project yet. We'll get back to one in just a second. What I wanted to start with is an ice cream sundae. Okay. Now, here's the rules involved. We're going to plan our ice cream sundae. We're going to scope. What do we want on our ice cream? We're going to figure out what the design is, what's it going to look like. I want you to think about what do you need to construct that ice cream sundae? And then at the end of it, you need to make sure that you're ready to make the next ice cream sundae. You're going to do the operations and the maintenance activities so you're ready to make the next ice cream sundae. Because this is a cycle, remember, it's a cycle. So here we go, our scoping exercise for a sundae. We're going to build a Wordle. Let's see what you put down for my ice cream sundae. Okay? You're going to build the ice cream. How big is it going to be? Absolutely. What data do you need to collect to build your ice cream sundae? You need ice cream. Very good. Yay. What flavor? Maybe you think about the flavor. Oh, you got a dish. That's good. What toppings do you want to put onto it? Sprinkles and cream I got. Good. Okay. You got a container to put it in? Okay. You want many flavors. Yeah. What flavors are available? What toppings? Oh, you need a scooper. Very good. I got a scooper. That's good. How am I going to eat this puppy? Oh, someone's got a banana. Oh, somebody else is lactose intolerant. You got to have your lactose tablets. Oh, a spoon. Yep, that's good. Where are you going to store everything? Do you have a fridge? Okay. Yep, it's got a freezer. Maybe you need a fridge too to store the cream and the cherries. Is there a cherry in? Yeah, who's actually doing the work? Are you doing it yourself? Is somebody else? Is this part of a big project? Okay. You're getting closer. Oh, hey, very good. Somebody put in napkins. A good ice cream sundae absolutely needs napkins. Yep. Ah, I like it, the treadmill, so that you can get ready to eat the next one. That's good. That's good. When are you going to eat it? What's the weather? Is it outside or inside? Okay. I'm looking for two more things. I don't see them yet. They're pretty important. Oop, they put it over in the Q&A. They didn't put it on the main screen, but I told you, you can always use the Q&A. You got to clean it up. When you're done with whatever you're going to do, you got to clean it up and you got to put it ready to make the next one. And then also over in the Q&A, they mentioned the fact is how much money do you have to spend on that ice cream sundae? I'd love to have 8 flavors and 15 different toppings and a bunch of different types of cones and stuff to put it in, but yeah, maybe I've only got $10.85. So I got to figure that out. And somebody put in gloves. If maybe in a public setting, you need to have gloves because somebody cut themselves. Uh, I've seen that on Chopped way too often where they cut themselves. But you can do this on anything. So that's a scoping exercise for something as simple as an ice cream sundae. And yeah, you're going to prioritize the wants and the needs. Okay? Now let's do the same thing. Now, normally when we do this class, I'll let you choose between a bridge and a safety improvement. But because of those safety funds that are out there today, I want to purposely go through and do that on a safety project. And I picked one, just again, this case, I just picked one in advance because it's one of the priorities within the Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan. And that is we're going to be putting up MUTCD compliant curve warning signs and pavement markings. Okay, that meets the standards in the MUTCD. This includes a whole bunch of things. I'm going to let you think about what those are. And why is this so important? Because it keeps the vehicle on the roadway. It reduces head-on crashes, rollover crashes, fixed object crashes, nighttime crashes, and all your curves where most of the crashes occur. It's really important. So we have good signage on our curves. So we're going to do a scope exercise. I first have to get in here. Let me get in here. Don't start yet. Hang on. Let me clear the responses because we just ate our ice cream sundae and we cleaned it up. Okay. So now, what do we need? What is in the scope for an MUTC compliant curve signs and markings in your community? Let's see what you come up with. Okay. What are the project limits? Which curves are you doing? Do you have crash data to just look at things? Is there rail systems involved? Okay. That's good. Traffic study. You definitely want to do a traffic study. Okay. Did you do a ball bank study on the advisory speed? That's good. That's on my list. Yeah, very good. Okay. You could have used the accelerometer or the Riker system like the state's using, but you definitely want to figure out what you need for the curve safe speed. Yep. What's the geometry of the site? Because if you're putting up chevrons or delineators, how many do you need? How many different curves are there? What are the standards for the height of the sign? Okay. So you need to make sure you know what the right answer is for that. Okay. You have to check both the national and the state MUTCD supplement. Yeah. Oh, and by the way, the state's got some slight different things that they're doing. Those are not out yet, but if you talk to the right people, state DOT and maybe your LTAP center, we can help you make sure you meet the new standards just as well. Yeah. Okay. I'm looking for 3 or 4 more things that I don't see in here yet. You got them last time at the ice cream sundae, but they're pretty important. If you're developing your scope, as you're starting to write everything that, there it is, there it showed up, finally popped up. Cost. Cost is absolutely key. You got to start put that in there. We've got posting. Now, posting could be the posting of the signs, but it could also be the posts themselves. What are you using for post? What do you have for breakaway hardware? Do you have a contingency? What are the speeds? Did you do both directions? That actually makes a big difference. Okay? So start to develop a list of the things you want to do to be MUTCD compliant. And while you're out there, do you do additional things? And of course, very good. That was the last one I had, and that is when it's all done, who's going to maintain it? Is it been set up? And that's going to be done with local dollars. You got to maintain it. So you need a cost, you need a good budget. Develop a good scope. You'll be really happy with yourself if you do. And here's the other challenge. Once you develop that scope, try not to change it too much. It's real easy to get scope creep. It's real easy to have a project just get out of hand. Okay? So develop a plan. And again, it's going to get tweaked during the design phase, I guarantee it. But try to be careful about what are the limits in terms of the scope, because wouldn't it be nice? Can cause you some issues if you're not careful. So just be aware of that. Okay? By the way, in this case, I didn't see anybody put down traffic lines. Are you going to include traffic lines in there? Your pavement markings? Is the curve wide enough? Now, think about all of these things in your process when you're doing a scope. Okay? Now, once you have a draft scope, now it's actually time to go out and hire the consultant. Okay? So you're going to select a consultant. You should have done this in-house with your own people. If you have a consultant on retainer, you're probably going to be hiring a separate consultant to do the actual major project. There are some ways to do some things in-house. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but here's where you're going to decide who is the designer. Okay? I will tell you, for small projects, if you've got good staff, great. If it's a big project, having a consultant is actually nice because it can separate both from a liability standpoint, but also gets 2 different viewpoints looking at issues. Now, this is in the Local Projects Manual, Chapter 6. You make sure you look at the most current version, and here are your options. Okay? Now, if it's federally funded, okay, it could be a municipal employee. That is actually okay to use the engineer on staff for a federal project. When I worked at Yates County DOT, we got, I want to say it was 4 federal projects, though I'm not sure. I can't remember. One of them might have actually been a state project for some bridge work we did. Um, but I did the engineering on 2 of them. But 2 of them, we had a consulting firm do the engineering. As I said, I started realizing, big projects, I like to actually have the consultants. But if you're a big department, Yates County is not very big, but if you're a Monroe County or an Allegheny County or New York City, yeah, you can do a municipal employee. You could do a retained consultant if that consultant was chosen through a qualified base selection process or an RFP process. You could hire a separate qualified base selection consultant. Okay, so QBS selected consultant is just fine. Okay, so if there's federal dollars involved, you have to go through the process of making sure that person meets certain standards. Versus if it's locally funded, you can use your own local process that you've got. Now, I will tell you right now, you really should be using a QBS, okay? You should still be using a QBS required in a lot of cases, okay? If there's state aid, it actually technically should still be there, okay? Again, it could be your engineer as long as they've been selected through a competitive process. But just keep that in mind we should be selecting based on qualifications. Now, if you're doing qualified-based selections, just keep that in mind. You're going to be placing an advertisement, you're going to be evaluating proposals, and you're going to interview the top-rated firms. Okay, once you've done that, you're going to re-rank possibly. That's one method that's used, and you're going to re-rank them on interviews, and you're going to do a final selection. Now, this is one of the challenges with QBS. Quality-based selection at the federal level, cost is not a factor. Okay, now when you negotiate with them at the end, you can bring cost in to say, hey, no, but that's in the negotiation phase. The choosing cost is not a factor. This is the Brooks Act, just so you know, for professional services where that comes into play. I have good news for you. And you're going, this is going to be challenging. I have very good news for you. The county highway superintendents and the State Department of Transportation developed something known as the Local Design Service Agreement, and that's linked in your handout. You don't have to memorize this. This LDSA, as it's called, is hosted, the results are hosted on the County Highway Superintendent's website. As you see, it's right there. And again, it's linked in the handout. What they've done is they've done a lot of the preliminary work. Now, you're still going to need to develop a list of project criterion. You're still going to have a selection committee, and you're still going to have to do some ratings. But the cool thing is you then only have to contact the firms that meet your criterion that are already on the LDA list by region. So it's a lot shorter process. So they're already essentially pre-qualified as long as you choose from them, and then you need to choose 3 firms and pick the best one. Much simpler, much quicker, and you should be in pretty good. Okay? And so this is for the consultant, remember, this is not for the construction. This is just for the engineering side of the house, the design side of the house in the QBS. Okay. So this is for professional services, if you think of it that way, hiring an engineer. Okay. Now, the last time they released the list, there's a new list that's out there, but the last time they did this a couple of years ago, it happened to occur on March 14th. So I've left my pie in there just having a fun picture. No, it's not a pie I made. You can see the edges are hard. I found it on the web. Now, again, once you've chosen a firm, you're going to negotiate with that firm, looking at the task list. You can use an independent estimate to look at the cost. This is where you can start to think about cost, negotiating those tasks, and you can apply those costs of salary and overhead at that point, and that's where you can start negotiating what you're able to do and not able to do. And if you just can't come to an agreement, that's where you could go to your next firm on the list. If you need to, and in some cases you're required to do an audit depending on the project size, and you may have to have a consultant agreement, and that's going to have to be sent to DOT, and then eventually it's going to have federal language in it. Now, once you've got an agreement with them, everybody's on the same page, you're going to send that to the RLPL, okay, the Regional Local Project Liaison, okay? So keep that in mind, and we're in good shape. Now, let me see in the Q&A. Can the consultant contractor provide a previous audit report? How old can the report be? They can, but I don't remember off the top of my head what that time frame is, because that's why it's in the standards. But it's only a few years. Okay. Certainly anything my brain wants to say 3 years, and it might even be a case whereby the report has to be within the current cycle of the LDSA. I don't remember off the top of my head. That'd be a good one when we do the questions, the Q&A. Why don't we throw that into the Q&A pile? So I'm going to ask Amanda to pull that one out for me and send it to me, and I'll add it to the Q&A pile later on. We'll ask the DOT and the feds, what the heck, they're here. Now, let me ask you this. We talk about disadvantaged business enterprises, and we'll talk about this a lot more detail about what that means. But when you're hiring a consulting firm, okay, is disadvantaged business enterprise participation required for consultants? Is that a yes? Is that a no if they're already on the LDA list? Is that a hard no because it's a professional service, or it depends? Okay? Little Jeopardy music there. Well, that's a pretty good, you guys are pretty good. I like you. You're pretty good. The answer is pretty much yes. Yeah, they're still required. There's still a participation level that has to be in there with the limitations funds might tell you certain things. Firms on the LDSA are not exempt from that requirement. So if there's a 20% level that's proposed, then you might have to meet that. And the reason that it depends is I find that an okay answer. There may be NOFOs that don't have a DB requirement. They're usually listed in the DOFO. It's never just a hard no. I would always look at the notice of funding opportunity. Most notice of funding for construction design are going to have a DBE in it. Okay? So just be aware of that fact. If you're not sure, assume yes. Don't assume no. This is not one of those where it's better to get forgiveness and permission. Okay? And somebody asked about the difference between the DB and WNB. We will come back to that. And the answer is absolutely yes, there is a difference. And we'll come back to that. I promise you, we have several slides talking about the difference between the state and federal programs. Now, once we've done that, surprisingly, it's a pretty quick process. They can move on to preliminary design. We're almost done with our scoping phase. Okay? So we can notice and proceed. We have to get that notice. This is just a stopping point, okay? Just to keep that in mind. And this is the stopping point that moves us from scoping into design. And this is covered in chapters 7, 8, and 11 of the Local Projects Manual. So now we're going to switch over to the design phase. Hopefully we've got a good scope. We've got an engineering firm or our in-house engineers on board, and everybody's ready to go. So let's do design. And this is going to be chapters 7, 8 of the Local Projects Manual, and 11. And then the Project Development Manual that's also available from the New York State DOT is the one they use, and you can use it as well. Okay? Now, design has the most steps. And the reason for this is there are sort of stopping points where we want to look at, okay, how are we doing? Good, move on. And so that's really the reason there's all these steps that are involved. In fact, even within preliminary design, there's actually up to 4 phases, depending on the project size that you might be dealing with. Each project needs to look at how big the scope is. This is where you're going to be going back and looking at your scope and making sure it's federal aid eligible. Okay? So look and go, oh, that component's not federal aid eligible. Then you have to decide what do you do at that particular point. The good news is if you get to a point before you hit turn shovels, you can pull back and not have to worry about funding problems. But once you start turning shovels and getting money, you want to make sure you're federal aid eligible. So this is where you're doing this. This is where your technical decisions are going to be made. Okay? Are you using this kind of pile? Are you going to use this kind of post for a safety improvement? Are you putting in speed humps or speed tables for an intersection issue? This is where the technical decisions are being made, and they're made between the local sponsor and the consulting firm. Federal Highway is not getting involved. DOT is really looking at it from a compliance and does it meet federal and state standards. You'll be doing your environmental reviews here, okay? And of course, you're going to be coordination in this particular case with a whole bunch of agencies. And we'll talk about those in just a second. But this is also where you need to start getting that public involvement and where you do a final estimate of your schedule and your cost, okay? So you absolutely, this is where you're going to want to do some preliminary hearings dealing with the public. What is going to be the final scope before we actually go to building it? Okay. You may have wanted to do a hearing before then, but this is a place where you are required to do it in some cases. Okay. And you can do your final estimate of your schedule and cost. So who do we coordinate with? Just think about that. Let's look at our safety project that we're doing. We're going to use that one today just because, again, that safety money's out there. But who am I going to have to coordinate if I'm putting in a whole bunch all over my municipality curve signs? Yeah, I'm going to have to deal with all the affected local municipalities, the utilities, because maybe I want to punch some signs in the ground and there's a gas line right there. Okay? You're going to want to bring the community involved, the residents in the area. Yeah. Okay? Utilities, municipality, legislature, of course, is going to be on there. You want to make sure who's impacted, things like that. What are the stakeholders? Okay. Is this folks from the state? Is it an intersection? What if there's a railroad track? Before you actually punch a hole in the ground, you need to call 811. And for most of upstate, that's UDIG. Downstate, it would be the Long Island, New York City call center. Okay, that you're going to be dealing with. You might have to deal with historical things. You might have to deal with right-of-way issues. Again, that's going to be part, hopefully you did it back in your scoping process to figure out what's involved. Okay? So again, think about that. Now, we're talking about a safety project. The list is probably actually a little shorter. If it was a non-safety project, if it was a bridge project, for instance, and we're getting into a stream, now we got to start talking about environmental issues and DEC and Army Corps of Engineers. And you're going to need to, again, same process, make a list of who's going to be involved. If I was up in Essex County, what agency would I have to add to this pile? Well, obviously, I'd have to add in the Adirondack Park folks. Okay? Now, most signs on a curve are going to stay the same. There's no changes. But again, these are people that might be involved. Okay? So, who's involved in the public involvement side? Who do I want at that public hearing? Whether it's a bridge project or a safety project, any project, who do I want there? Who is the public in this case? It's going to be landowners, taxpayers, absolutely. The neighbors that are near the project that might deal with the noise. Community advocates. Yeah, your elected officials, your politicians do need to be part of this. This is where they should be involved because it's going to affect possibly taxes, short term and long term. Are there schools in the area? Are there people who have boats? Maybe you're working near a lake. Okay. Um, are the school buses going to be involved? Do they actually have to change their school bus route a little bit? For a bridge project, absolutely. Are there grassroots groups that you might want to have involved? This is where, when it comes to public involvement, there are some required meetings. We'll talk about a couple of those. I'm a really big fan of trying to set up a meeting early on, even during the scoping phase, where you bring people together and you talk about the project. In fact, try to get solicit some ideas from them. And if you can do it at a local facility, a local fire hall or a, VFW facility that's close by where the actual project's going, even better. Don't make people go crazy. How many meetings do you need to have? There are a couple that are required. We'll talk about those. This would be a preliminary thing would be done during the scoping, just one usually, but again, depends on the size of the project. You know, if you're changing a whole bunch of signs over a large area, you might do more. It might not be critical in some cases too, but again, something to think about. Now, let's rear our ugly head for the right of way. Ooh, right of way. Somebody did ask, by the way, I'll just answer this quick question. What distance for the invitation parameters? Most people would probably have to drive. So again, it would be more of a time frame. You'd probably do an evening event and just think about what would be a good time that they would be moving. Obviously, that's going to be different in terms of distance in New York City, for instance, than it would be in Essex County. So, some people will drive half an hour to 45 minutes, but probably not much more than that. You could do it online, by the way. There's procedures for doing virtual public involvement that are through the Everyday Counts initiative from the Federal Highway Administration, if you're interested. So let's talk about right-of-way. Right-of-way is key. With federal right-of-way, you got to have it in writing. Okay? So right-of-way addendums have to be part of the design report. This is part of what's known as the Federal Uniform Act, or the Federal Right-of-Way and Real Estate Acts, or the New York State Eminent Domain Law. Now, officially, they are the Federal Uniform Relocation Assistance and Real Property Acquisition Policy Act. Yes, I have it in my notes, but everybody calls it the Uniform Act. It's the Federal Right-of-Way and Real Estate Act. That one stays the same. And the New York State Eminent Domain Procedure Law, i.e., you have to have the right-of-way in writing. Okay? That means if you have to do a title search, that has to be included in your documentation. You're going to prepare all of these and you're going to put them in a binder, or as it's called, a brochure of all this. That includes the maps and the deeds and everything that you've got and any property appraisal, especially if you're having to purchase land. Okay? And in the beginning of it or at the end, and depending on how it's organized, you're going to have a table of all of your right-of-way acquisitions. Now, we're talking about it now, but you're actually not doing any of this until a little bit later. But this rears an ugly head, a reality problem that exists. And that is something known as a road by use or a street by prescription. Okay? If you are with a town or a village, most of your roads and streets fall into this category, which means that The right-of-way is controlled by what's been used by the public and maintained by the municipality for 10 or more years. Okay? So let me just ask. Let's assume it's a road by use. Okay? Road by use. I don't have a deed. I don't have a piece of paper. Where's the edge of the right-of-way? You can actually click on the picture. Where's the edge of the right-of-way here? Some people are putting the fence line. Some people put the edge of the pavement. A lot of you put the tree. Yeah. So got a note about some tools. Watch which thing you're popping into. Some people say the center line. No, it's not the center line. That's the good news. The good news is a road by use or a street by prescription. What you've paved absolutely would be in the right of way. There's no arguments about that because you've paved it, you've got a public use, you're maintaining it. If there's no ditch, you may not have anything off the asphalt. And that tree absolutely is outside the right of way because you've let something grow up that's a fixed object, a safety issue. So technically, the right of way may actually go from the beginning of that fence and then bump in front of the tree and then go back out. It can be very confusing. And that is why, as part of the federal process, you have to have the right of way in writing. You cannot just use a road by use. So if it is a road by use, you're going to need to go through the process of preparing right of ways. They don't have to be purchased, but they do have to be added to the person's deeds. Okay? Easements. So let's give a couple of quick examples of why this is so critical. Okay? So let's look at a sidewalk that's just at the outside edge of the right of way. Okay? So here is the sidewalk. I just marked it for you. Okay? And there's the other sidewalk. And then I'll put back in the lines that were shown on the survey so you can see the lines that exist. There's one, there's the other. Okay? Um, there's a question in the Q&A there, Amanda. Throw that into my pile that I'll add to later on for QBS. So where would be, what would you have to do if you needed to work on that sidewalk? What would you have to do if you wanted to work on that sidewalk? Well, you'd have to get in writing an easement outside that section, okay? You'd have to get an access agreement or part of the deed that would be on there. If it was just a street by use or a road by use, there could be arguments about what that actually is because a sidewalk may or may not count. It certainly does not in the case of a town because that's not a highway function. So you might not even have that. That might be the apparent one that the surveyor used. So you're going to need an easement of some type. So here's another one. I'll do one more. Okay. So I've got 4 clicks. There's my existing sidewalk. There is the boundary. In this case, there is a deed. They actually have a deed. Okay. So the deed shows the street boundary literally at the southern edge of the actual pavement. And it's actually, the sidewalk is outside. So if you wanted to work on that sidewalk and put a sidewalk along the southern side, click on where you'd need to have for a right-of-way when you're all said and done. If you're going to work on that sidewalk on the southern end, you're going to have to have at least the width of that sidewalk and maybe a little bit more. Okay? So that's going to be a challenge for you. Okay? Now, someone noticed that NYSEG may purchase permanent easements. Yeah, you can purchase it. There's processes for purchasing it. Okay? And yes, there are some times when people say an easement isn't good enough. It does meet the requirements, but people, it's got to be well written and it really needs to be tied to the person's deed. That's going to be the key more than anything else. You can't just do something that's an agreement that gets in a file. It really needs to be something that can be discoverable later on, if you want to think of it that way. So it's filed at the county clerk's office. So when you're going down looking at the deed, you're like, oh, there's an easement attached to that or now part of that deed that says what the right of way is. In this particular case, myself, I can tell you right now. Oh, that's right. I have to go back up one. You're going to think about where you might want to be putting in your sidewalk. I'm going to try something here. Yeah, I'll go with purple today. And let's see if this trick works. It said it worked, and it worked for me earlier, but we'll see if it works now. I'm probably going to want to have, did that work? Yeah. I'm probably going to want to have a nice straight line where I put in my sidewalk and maybe a little bit more. Think about where that's going to be. And then you're going to need to have a legal description. Nice thing about a straight line, especially if it's parallel, relatively easy to draw out. And you're going to want to have a map and legal description that's part of that incidental brochure. Okay? Just a couple of examples that we got sent to us to illustrate the kind of craziness you can run into. Okay? So here is a sidewalk. The street is over to the right, where it says 262 square feet and point of curvature, which, okay, great. The right-of-way line is actually here. So you actually have this stretch of roadway here, right here, that's not in the right-of-way. And oh, by the way, if it's a deeded roadway, it's not a road by use, you don't get that ability to say, hey, it's part of the road. No, you have to purchase it. You're going to have to compensate that person for their property. You can't just do the work because that's now a taking. In fact, if you've got a road by use that's existing and you want to widen it, you can't just do it. You have to get permission from someone to do so. And in the case of federal projects, you got to get it in writing. And you're going to have to make an amendment and hook it onto their deed. Now, I know we have some folks from New York City. How many of you that are from New York City have gone down and looked at the Hess Triangle down in Greenwich Village? Anybody raise their hands? I got one person. Cool. Down there in New York City, there is a piece of property. When they did some road work, they moved things around. They moved some roads around. They never properly took this small little triangle of land. That's now part of the public sidewalk in New York City. It's a 25-inch triangle that it's outside of a convenience store. Um, and so it actually was never properly done. And the Hess estate owners decided, we're just going to let folks know. Let's not get ourselves Hess triangles. So we need to make sure that as part of your plans, and this is going to eventually go into what's known as a design approval document, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. You absolutely want to make sure you have existing property lines, proposed acquisitions, and whether it's going to be a permanent, long-term right-of-way, or if it's just temporary during the construction phase. Okay? And again, make sure you have plenty. Don't shortchange yourself. Because when it comes to land acquisition, whether it's temporary or permanent, you don't want to be constrained too much. And if you need to purchase, you need to purchase. Okay? You can negotiate, okay? Or you can do an eminent domain or offer up to the amount of the appraisal, okay? But do you need more for construction? Okay? Keep these things in mind when you're doing right-of-way issues. When it comes to moving on, this is absolutely one of the places where you want to stop. And this is challenging for a lot of reasons, this is not where you do property negotiations. This is not where you're doing commitments and offers. You don't even acquire property at this point. You're just making a list of what you need during this phase. You do that later on. And people go, well, the prices will go up. Actually, no, they will not, because the process, the Uniform Act, uses appraisals, existing appraisals. So you can get your appraisals, but you're not doing negotiations at this particular point. Okay? Now we're going to move on to preparing that design approval document. Okay? So let's talk about that. The design approval document is sometimes called the DAD. Got a question that I want to answer. I'll go back to it. It says, how do you determine if a road is by use or deeded? Some roads are old and had never been surveyed for years, if ever. Easiest way, we actually have a quick answer on our website. We're going to be taking a break here in about 10 minutes. We'll find it, throw it in the chat pod. But essentially, you're going to want to go down to the county clerk's office and find the deed and read that deed. If the deed says the property goes to the center line of the road, guess what? That's a road by use or a street by prescription. If it has a deed, it will be listed, and that's why these need to be filed through the clerk's office. Okay? Don't use tax maps. Please don't use tax maps. Okay? So our DAD or design approval document, and yes, I don't have on a bow tie this time, but I'm the guy in the middle. The design approval document is going to have a lot of things in it. So let's just ask a question before we get into this too much. What do you think would be in here? What do you think would be in the design approval document? The limits of the work, the existing conditions, the environmental issues, the design criterion. You're going to have some costs. You're going to have preliminary design. Essentially, everything you did during the scoping phase. And then you're going to add in some additional items, such as the environmental issues, such as the right-of-way issues, such as alternatives. I see that in here, yeah, that you might be choosing between, a steel deck versus a concrete deck, uh, cold mix versus hot mix for a roadway improvement, things like that. Paved shoulders versus unpaved shoulders. Yeah. Crash information if it's got a safety component to it. Yeah. The idea here is this is the thing that essentially sets the final scope, if you think of it that way. So let's get your pen ready, and I want to walk through some of the regulatory items that are also part of that design approval document. Okay? Now, yes, some of these are acronyms. We'll walk through each of these, and then that'll be about right to take our mid-morning, mid-lunch, midday, whatever we call the next break. Okay. Now, the first one is the Federal Environmental Approval Worksheet, or FEAW. You may see both. Um, again, like a lot of things, it falls into this category where I tell people, I love forms, I hate paperwork. Okay? The idea here is you fill out this worksheet and you don't miss something. So you walk through the environmental approvals. So you don't miss something, especially things that fall under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, okay? Protecting certain critters. This is not a protected critter. When they come out, these things come out in the hundreds, little ants, sometimes called an American newt. But there are critters that are going to be part of this, okay? And that's a moving target. So you cannot say, well, it was true last time. No, 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 that's a moving target. You need to check and see what's falling under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. Okay. And of course, there's going to be a state process too. So the state has the Environmental Quality Review Act, or SEQR. Okay. And you're going to fill out an assessment form, and you're typically the lead agency if you're the local. Okay. There's a handbook. We link to it in the handbook. Okay. You need to make sure you've looked at the Endangered Species Act. Is there endangered species in your particular area? Here in New York State, a lot of things we worry about are bats and certain turtles and certain uh, species that are in the ocean, especially along the Atlantic and parts of the Hudson. Um, so you're going to have to look at the kind of work you're doing and see if that's going to affect those endangered species. A safety project that's just putting in signs, you might just get a declaration, nope, no impact. But other kinds, when you're working, especially on a retaining wall, you're doing something with a bridge, you're going to have to include that in there. Okay. And so you may have to have some consultation to deal with that before that's signed off. Okay. So you got to look at endangered species that might be affected. Again, if you're not sure, go start talking to your local project liaison. Okay. You're going to have to look at your essential fish habitat areas. Now, these are fish that are in salt waters, okay? So if you look at the maps that are list for essential fish habitats, that's going to essentially be everything around Long Island, of course, any streams that come in and out of Long Island, so most of Long Island is included, and all the way up the Hudson to Albany, okay? Because the fish that are involved in here, these are herring, flounder, things like that. you're going to have to look at those essential fish habitats and protect them to some extent. So that has to be in there. Okay. And by the way, there may be time restrictions when work can be done. So that's why it's so important to include that now. So for instance, with the flounder, you can't work from January 15th until May 31st. So even if the weather were good, you're going to have to hold off. And so when you're developing your plan for the construction phase, you have to realize that you can't do work in the stream in that period of time. So that's something you're going to have to be thinking about. Now, for or actually it overlaps, but anything that's dealing with water is going to be involved with wetlands and Clean Water Acts and things like that. You're going to have to determine the process. Anything above a half an acre, or excuse me, less than half an acre, there is a streamlined process, okay, that's available through the Army Corps of Engineers. The key is in all of this is what are your avoidance measures and how do you deal with the impacts to the wetlands? The best thing to try to do is avoid them, but obviously that can't always be done when it comes to a road, so there's a process involved. And again, that's something we'd have to spend a lot more time on. There's actually a whole video on that in the essential videos that I mentioned earlier, and you can also look at issues that deal with that in the local design manual, the local project manual. And yes, you may have to deal with floodplains and all that fun stuff. You have to deal with the Historic Preservation Act and ask this question. Does the project have a potential to cause effect on historic properties? Okay. And then what is a historic property? You may need to contact the New York State's Cultural Resource Information System folks to talk about this, to make sure that we're not getting at something that's historical. Okay. And that's going to be something that's on the National Register of Historic Places, and you're going to be also need to talk to SHPO as well, the State Historical Preservation Office might be involved. Okay. Um, and so you are going to need documentation to show all of this, and that's going to be included in your design approval document. New York State does have cultural resource coordinators at the regional level that can work with you on this, and there is Federal Highway that can help with that, and you could even do a consultant if you need to. You can talk to Federal Highway. They actually can help you determine that there's no adverse effect or there's no historical properties. This is one case where Federal Highway will probably get involved at some point if there's historical stuff. There is an odd act which causes some confusion to folks. Use it with the USD/DOT Act of 1966. There's a section there that talks about anytime you're doing work that includes publicly owned parks, recreation areas, wildlife or waterfowl refuges, or any public or privately owned land that's on the historic list. So it's an overlap with that historic preservation stuff. Here's the thing. If you have a town park, there could be a trail. If you're working within the right of way of that trail or in that park boundary, you have to go through this process. You have to meet those requirements. Okay? And what that essentially says is you have to identify the use of the property. And again, Federal Highway will eventually get involved, and they're going to determine, first off, you're doing something that's so minor, like you're repaving right across the trail is de minimis. There's no real change to any features or attributes. You just move on. Okay. If not, then you're going to have to do an evaluation. You're going to have to give the public a chance to comment. They actually get a chance to comment on any of these projects, but you absolutely have to include them in that particular case. And so you're going to, if there is beyond that, you're going to have an agreement. And that agreement is going to make sure that you've met and looked at the issues of historic issues, and that may include historic bridges, historic sites. If you're doing a bikeway or walkway project, absolutely think about this because a lot of old bike and walkways, we turn a rail to trail, there may be some historical implications involved, and it falls into this particular act. Now, if it's minor involvements, you're going to be able to do that with an agreement. And here's the key. This is actually, if you can show this, you can almost always move on. I said almost always move on, and that is if a transportation project has a net benefit. I mean, you can't tear down an old house just because there's a net benefit that's truly historical. That's different. But if you're just crossing into an area that happens to be a park and there's a net benefit, You can do that through this concept of having the agreement, the programmatic agreement. And that's going to spell out what you can and cannot do for the project, which of course may affect the design. You might have to move where the abutment is for a bridge, for instance, or you might have to align something slightly differently. Though, again, if there's a net benefit and safety is a benefit, you usually can do it with some limited situations. Okay? Um, so somebody asked in the Q&A, a trail that crosses the road requires 4F consideration even if no crosswalk is marked. Would the crossing need to comply with ADA and MUTCD crosswalk requirements? Well, first off, it always has to meet ADA. ADA is not dependent upon any of this. As I said earlier, ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, comes into play if there's public use. Okay? Now, whether it falls into the building or the PROWAG requirements, the key is there's being a reasonable alternative for those who have issues, whether they're in a wheelchair or a walker or even colorblind people. Um, but when it crosses it, if that's an official park, the answer would be yes. So if you're redoing work on a roadway and that's an official crossing, that is a trail, we have one here in Ithaca, for instance, yeah, then you would have to look at the 4S considerations. So there's something to just keep in mind. And by the way, if it's not crossed, the crossings tell you who has the right of way. If you're at an intersection, the public always has the right of way. If you're at a mid-block with your crossing, if you don't mark it, the cars still have the right of way. And we could talk about that in the safety class. Now, this is where you're going to be doing public meetings, and this is where you're required to have some public meetings, okay? There are not always required public meetings, and that's spelled out depending on the type of the project, okay? If you do have a public meeting, you would do that at the design approval document stage, and you would document what you got for feedback from the public, and that would be incorporated into the design approval document, okay? The key is I still think a public hearing is not a good idea, even if it's not required. And if it's not required, I'd actually do it back in the scoping phase myself to get your public feedback. But there are certain projects, especially larger projects, where it's required. And again, if you're doing something where you're involving a historic feature and you're following that US DOT Act, you do have to have public input, and the public meeting can be a form of that. And then with all of this, somebody says, does design to the PROWAG play a role here? PROWAG is just the public right-of-way part of the ADA, and so the answer would be yes. Okay. So anytime you're doing this, think about the documents that are going to be the supporting documents, like the Highway Design Manual for activities that are involved is a document you probably want to have, and that's through the New York State DOT. Okay. With that, we are going to get our design approval document. We're going to stop. We're going to get approval for it. And I think this is an absolute perfect time. And the clock tells me we're actually 1 minute behind, but we'll make it up to you later. We're going to go ahead and take our lunch break now. And I'm going to write down the slide number so I don't forget where I am. And we will go forward later. And we will see everybody at 12:30. And I am going to activate the what questions do you have? Huh. Something broke. I will get the question thing working, and we'll see everybody at 12:30. See you in a bit. Okay, we're gonna get started back up here. Hope everybody had yourself a good lunch. I watched them building the a new building out here. They have a huge crane that's like 400 feet tall when it's fully straight up. It's pretty cool to watch. Okay, let me see if we got any new questions. Keep asking questions. We'd like to have them. Okay. So now we're up to step 7. We're going to now start doing detailed design. This is where we get into the final design phases, 5 and 6 that we're dealing with. It's a fairly short process. Really, you're just taking everything you've done for the design approval document and everything you've been doing up to this point, and it's the final review of everything. So this is where you're really getting into the nitty-gritty. This is where you actually acquire the property, okay, that we talked about. Okay. Now, one of the questions that came up during the lunch break dealt with the historical stuff. I just want to make sure I didn't forget to cover that. The historical review that's done during the design approval document, that actually is done by the DOT. Okay. So it's done through SHPO, but it's actually done um, by state DOT on behalf. Okay, so that's how FHWA set that up. So, and it's in the local projects manual just to show you there's so many little details. And thank you for sending that in and helping us get that one covered. So we're going to acquire a right of way. We're now in the right of way acquisition phase. This is when you notify the affected property owners. And the idea is you're going to provide just compensation to folks. Okay. Um, and the written offer is for that amount. You're not paying above that. You're paying for what has been looked and reviewed at. Okay. You're going to make your payments here, and you're actually going to get the title and or the rights to the property. Okay. Titles are preferred. State DOT doesn't with titles, but again, the key is it has to be a written record. Okay. Okay. So make sure, by the way, when you do your title search, make sure you don't have any liens. Make sure there's a right to transfer the land. There's not something keeping it from being transferred. You don't want to do that afterwards and find out because that can create all kind of problems. So make sure that the title search goes way back and look everything over. Okay, so the basic steps essentially is an appraisal, figuring out the just compensation, title searches, map creation, offer negotiation, closing, and so on. Okay. Here's the way to think about this, and the reason why it's so important to do this is you can't really have a public facility on private property. I was out walking, and I won't tell you what state I was in, but I was out walking in another state, and there's a right-of-way post. It even says it on it. There's a right-of-way post. There's a culvert that goes beyond that little brown and white right-of-way post. So now we have a situation where there's a public facility on private property. And that creates a huge liability situation. Part of the reason for the roads by use and streets by prescription was to not create that situation. But boy, does it create problems. And so that they don't want that in federal projects. And remember that the value is done, it is done, as somebody asked in the Q&A, by an independent appraiser. There's people who are certified to be appraisers, and they would be doing that. It's not a hard process, and there's plenty of companies that will do that. And that way you're not paying extra because somebody wants extra funds. You pay a certain amount for the appraised value of the land, not what they'd like to have. Okay? Before you can go out to bidding, by the way, you have to have that right-of-way acquisition clearance certificate. Okay? And that's going to be from the sponsor. DOT is going to be involved if there's a DOT right-of-way. In fact, if you're on the DOT right-of-way, you've got to get them involved. And it's signed by the real estate office with New York State DOT as well as the local owner. Once you've got that, you can then move on to preparing your contract documents. Okay, so now I'm going to prepare a contract document. What should be in the contract bid document? So you get to pull up your poll, which you probably had shut down before lunch, and now you got to pull it back up. So let's see what you guys are going to have in the contract bid documents. Okay, you're going to have your quantities. Yep. Mm-hmm. You're going to have your proposed schedule, your engineering estimate for the schedule. You're going to have any permits that have been done and agreements, especially environmental utilities, highway work permits, if you're in the state DOT right of way. You're going to have your estimate. So your PS&E, as we said earlier, the plan specifications and estimates are part of that process. Okay. You're going to have that design approval document, your construction management plan, which we'll talk about, and remind you of what's in there. Okay. You don't, subcontracts don't show up yet. Someone threw that in there. Now that's actually where the contractor decides they want to do subcontracts. This is for getting your contractor. You're going to have your terms and conditions, and they're both federal conditions and state conditions that have to be in there. Okay. You're going to have to link to whatever standards you're using. Generally, you're going to use New York State DOT standards. If you happen to do something outside of that, you need approval ahead of time. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Okay. And then everybody is, the site, the design approval documents. Some of these things you may point to some of the location, but these all need to be involved. Your right-of-way issues, contract drawings. Yeah, very good. Nice job. Okay. So let's just go through a few things. Your final plan, specifications and estimates, your construction management plan, Your right-of-way clearance, we got that. Your permits and agreements, we got that. Good, nice job. Your design approval document, um, the licensed professional who's responsible for the design. In other words, was it stamped by an engineer or an architect? Who's the person who's approved it? Usually, whether it's in-house or you've done it through a consulting agreement. The sponsor, the owner, has to have signed off on it. And of course, if it involves a national highway system or a state system, there has to be additional approvals. So you want to make sure if you are dealing with that, if you're not sure if you're on the national highway system, you need to find out early on. Okay. And of course, that estimate does need to be done by a licensed professional. That's part of the requirements. You got to have a licensed engineer involved in most cases. Okay. Now, in terms of those design documents, you can point to things. You don't have to print them all out. In fact, New York State specifications are online. So you could just link to those particular things. You absolutely have to use the New York State DOT specifications if you're on the national highway system, if you're on a state highway. And again, if you're on a public road, except in New York City, where they can use their own specifications that have been approved, by the way, you're going to have to get approval if you want to use something outside of New York State DOT specifications. So you can use some special specs, but they have to be approved ahead of time by the DOT. So if you have some odd thing, like you somehow want to use a cold mix, well, you'd have to get permission for doing that ahead of time. Most of the time, I just tell folks, use the state DOT specifications, okay? Make sure the drawings show the right-of-way lines, okay? There's somebody knows exactly where the right-of-way is, and if there's a temporary easement that you've got as part of the process, you want to make sure that's a thing in there. And of course, this can become real problematic, as someone mentioned. I see it over in the Q&A that if you're dealing in an urban area where there's a sidewalk, and the sidewalk may, when it's all said and done, be private property. Yeah, it needs to be included. You really need to have that because that can be a big challenge later on. And if you want to get a right-of-way clearance, you have to be very clear that that's not part of the project. Otherwise, you're going to have to go back and get that right-of-way line moved out to where it needs to be. There are federal provisions, standard clauses. There's prevailing wage rates. Somebody asked about that earlier. That's the federal Davis-Bacon Wage Rate Act. That means you have to pay people in certain positions a certain minimum wage rate. That's required. And if there's a building, you're going to have to go through New York State's WICS law provisions for buildings. So these are federal provisions. You can do alternative bids. Okay, so you could actually put in a choice between a couple of different proposals, but remember, you want that approved ahead of time. Okay, so you need to make sure that the DOT is aware of that. So that's why I'm saying pick up the phone, talk to the RLPL, and make sure everybody's on page. And then, of course, once that comes out, you're going to have to include any kind of addendums that go on and things like that. Now, someone asked about project labor agreements. Those will be done during the contract phase between the contractor and the laboring groups, okay? And then it'll be signed off by the local agency. So everybody gets involved in those things. It's part of the process of once you've opened everything up. So if you do have an addendum later on, make sure anybody who's picked up a copy gets a copy of it. You find out, oh, we forgot about X, Y, and Z. You update the contract documents. Everybody needs to know. Now, you cannot include, with some exceptions, and I'll talk about some exceptions, you cannot include most proprietary items. And I put an asterisk there because there are ways you can use a proprietary item. FHWA has reduced the restrictions. New York State still has some. But in either case, there are limitations. You really want to make sure everybody's on board and you're not doing something that would not be considered a proper proprietary item. You could have a proprietary item because it's some fancy widget that nobody truly makes. But if it's something that just happens to be one style versus another, that's not going to be kosher. So my advice, if it's something that's proprietary, go talk and get advanced ahead of time. You can't use warranties on a federal project. There's no warranty systems. There's no retainage. That's not allowed. Okay. And of course, you need to make sure your language doesn't conflict with federal and, of course, state requirements. Now, the ways you can build these things. You can do a competitive bidding process. That's by far the most common. Okay, so it's low cost. You could do force account, i.e. you build it yourself, but that has to have pre-approval ahead of time by DOT or FHWA. And the key is you have to show a public interest in cost effectiveness. So an example might be maybe a particular county has a bridge crew that's really good and has done these things for a while, and they can show they can do it effectively and they can do it efficiently and they can be compliant. There's a public interest, you might be able to do it with a force account. But if it's a big project, you're probably going to be looking at doing this via competitive bidding kind of operations. Now, most projects you can't do design build on local projects. There's design build, you've probably seen that. There are some exceptions in New York City, but for most local projects outside of New York City, there's not allowed. It's got to be a state project outside of New York City, and even within New York City, there are restrictions. But again, Federal Aid 101, we don't have the time nor everything to get involved with that. And examples of cases is asked of non-competitive procurement is desired. You got to have competitive bidding. That's the way it works. It's competitive bidding on federal projects. If you're using an existing contract, that existing contract had to go through that process. Okay, so if you're using something that's an existing contract, it's a competitive bid contract just by somebody else. That's okay, but there still has to have been a competitive bidding process involved. Has to be competitive when it's federal dollars involved, unless there's force account that's been pre-approved ahead of time. Now, some non-typical issues that come up that you might be aware of, there may be some public interest findings that require approval. So for instance, similar to the things that was asked about in the Q&A, if you're using the state public agency furnished materials, a perfect example of that is when they tore down the old Tappan Zee Bridge, Governor Malcolm Wilson Bridge, if you want its official name. They took the old panels and they gave them to agencies who wanted to use them for local bridges. They would need to have a public interest finding, which they got, and they were able to use those bridge deck panels rather than having to do them themselves. Again, specifying the use of proprietary items, especially if there is a matching item out there. If you want to designate storage or disposal sites, especially if they're off-site, you might need to think about including that. That's going to have to be approved ahead of time. And there are some limited warranties that can be used, but again, pre-approval. You need to talk, again, pick up that phone, talk to the regional project liaison, local project liaison, and you'll be better off. Now, I want to go through a few other contract issues that do come up quite often, okay, just so that we're on the same page, okay? Now, you may have heard of Build or Buy America, okay? It's actually, these days it's BABA, Build America, Buy America. That includes manufactured products. That includes steel and iron, i.e. construction materials, okay? And so, again, these things, there are some waivers, but there's not a waiver for non-steel, and most things they've dropped the waiver. If you're not sure, ask. And the concept is that we shouldn't be buying things that aren't made or built in America unless you just can't find it. If you're using foreign material, it has to be less than 0.1% of the contract or $2,500, whichever is less. Okay? No. Yes, whichever is less. Unless you have a pre-approval ahead of time, because it's just a proprietary item or something that can't be made any other way. Cost is not the factor, okay? Time is not the factor. Has to be essentially there's no other way to get the project done, okay? So, and actually I got it wrong here. I'm down here looking at my own notes. It's 0.1% of 2,500, whichever is greater. So if it was a $2 million contract, 0.1% would be 2,200, so the $2,500 would control. So you can go up to 2,500 unless it's a really big contract. Now, in terms of getting a waiver under Buy America, they have to be approved before. Now, it says before installation, but really, you really want to have it before you even go out to contract. There are very few nationwide things that are issued. I wrote down the last one I saw. The last one I saw was now over a year ago. Now, I get a daily update from the feds. I may have missed it, I'll be honest, but I don't remember seeing a Buy America general waiver in over a year. That involved electric chargers. There were a couple of state-specific ones for projects, one in Utah and one in Louisiana within the last year, but they don't occur very often. They essentially, there has to be essentially no other real good way to do it, or it's a de minimis cost, a very small grant. And remember, schedule is not the driver if the product is made in the United States. Okay. So when should you include a waiver? Well, truth be told, even though it says prior to installation, I would actually include them as a minimum the design phase and maybe even going further back towards the scoping or even planning phase. Soon as you realize you're going to have to be doing something that's not made in the United States for some reason, you want to let everybody know and get that process started. Don't wait. And again, the last one I had was for electric chargers. I haven't seen a new one since. I may have missed it, I'll be honest, but not many. You are going to have to do some civil rights reporting. That is still required. That's not changed. And that comes down to the idea of the disadvantaged business enterprises, or the EEO, Equal Employment Opportunity. And here's the thing. This is the real message to take home here. That is a federal program. New York State has you'll see MWBE, Minority and Women-Owned Business Enterprises. And you might also see a SDVOB, okay? This is a Service Disabled Veterans Opportunity. Realize that those are state programs. So the MWB program for New York State is not part of a federal project, and the Service Disabled Veterans Opportunity or Veterans-Owned Business is a state process. So if it's got federal dollars, the federal rules control, so you don't look at those programs. If you're doing a Culvert New York project that was only state funds, you would need to use that system. If you're using federal dollars, you're going to be using DBE and EEO. And there will be goals that are set up, and they are tailored to the type of work involved and where you are in the state. And they're looking at the availability of the work available and who can fill that role. Now, can you always meet the goal? Probably not in some cases. The commitment is based upon the bid. And so let's say that the dollar amount that's in the bid has a goal of, female goal is typically 6.9%, and the minority goal varies. Okay. So let's look at the minority goal, the DBE commitment. Let's say it's 8%. Okay. And the award amount is $500,000, $500,000. So what are you monitoring during the project to fulfill the requirements of a DBE? How much money are you looking at? Well, 8% times 500,000, right? Did everybody get 40,000? I hope so. I got 40,000. So you'd be monitoring $40,000 that needs to be part of the process to DBEs, if that's the commitment that was made. Okay. The contractor then has to follow requirements for recruitment, hiring, pay, and training that deal with EEO issues. And of course, that includes your promotion and retention issues as well. In other words, all of workforce development needs to include those same practices at all levels. And that includes, by the way, their subcontractors and their suppliers and their requirements involved for how you track that. If you can't meet the requirements, we start getting into things such as commercially useful functions. In other words, you don't count a DBE if it's just something that is not commercially useful. Okay, it has to be a distinct work element. Okay, so hiring somebody to do something that nobody else is doing, that's a commercially useful function. Just having someone who happens to be in a disadvantaged minority sitting in a truck does not. So there has to be an evaluation if you're not sure. Look at the workforce, okay? Look at their supervision. Who's supervising them? Look at the equipment that's involved. Are they actually running their own equipment, or are they just actually running your equipment? The contractor's equipment with somebody just from that party wouldn't count. There's limitations there, okay? So it has to be a commercially useful function. Now, if you're not sure, there's forms for that. There is a form you can use, okay? It's not, that we've seen them do good work. It's a verification process, sort of like Buy America in a lot of ways. And someone asked, does it have to be evenly distributed over the contract time frame? Nope. It's just the total amount. Okay. And yes, if you are on a Native American land, if you're in a something that's owned by the tribe, yes, you're going to have to meet requirements that they've got as well. Because guess what? Those rules control. So yeah, you may have a third set of rules to look at depending where you are. So you need to know where you're doing the work. There's information you have in terms of asking the question about whether something is a CUF. That's from the equal EB40 forms that you can fill out. They're available online. And again, like anything, the forms are here to help you figure out the right questions to ask. So you can use this to help figure out whether or not it's commercially useful or not. So let me just ask you a couple of quick case studies here. So you got a disadvantaged business enterprise, a DBE subcontracted to furnish and install rebar on a deck. Okay, that would be a pretty commercially useful function if they're doing it. A review of the documents submitted with the material certifications showed that the steel was delivered and invoiced to the prime contractor, not the sub. So this documentation indicates what? Does it indicate that the DB negotiated price and ordered the rebar? Further review is required. The DB only needs to submit proof of payment to demonstrate a commercially useful function, or the DB did not perform a commercially useful function. Yeah, B is the right answer. There's just a few things we don't know. We know that what they're doing would be considered commercially useful, but because the bill went to the prime, we don't have enough information to know what portion of their work counts towards the CUF. Okay? It could be it just happened to get billed to the prime, but it was ordered by the DBE. You could count it in that case, but you're going to have to figure that out. If not, you don't count the delivery of the bar, you only count the cost of putting the bar in place in that particular case. So they've got to figure that out because that's the key. When you're calculating it out, it's what they actually did. If it is a subcontractor, it's 100%, but it could be less if, like in this case, if the bar was actually purchased by the prime and then the subcontractor came in and placed the bar, they wouldn't get credit for the bar cost. They would only get credit for the work they actually do. In the case of trucking, again, it's 100%, but you got to make sure that it's owned. The trucks are owned and operated by the DBE. They're not just, again, sitting in the truck. Okay, so you got to make sure that they've got that. And it's by the way, there's got to be a lease at least, a long-term lease. It can't just be borrowing a truck from somebody else. You have to own and operate it. Regular dealers, delivery folks, it's only going to be 60%. Okay, that's a brokerage. That's about the best they can get. But the manufacturer, on the other hand, is at 100%. If you're hiring somebody to do service, like for instance, a lot of consulting firms use accountants who would fit under those requirements, well, reasonable fees and commissions count. Okay, so again, look at those things. So keep that in mind. That's the kind of thing that's important to understand when it comes to counting things like that. Okay, if you can't get enough folks to do a commercially useful function, you can't meet the DB requirements, you can do what's known as a good faith effort. Okay, so give me an example of what you would have to do to get a good faith effort to show that, hey, I can't find a disadvantaged business in my area to do a particular activity. What kind of things can you do? And while you're answering that, someone asked in the Q&A, so DB delivery of materials does not constitute a CUF. The delivery could, if they did all the work for delivery, but if it's delivered by a plain dealer, then it wouldn't, if that plain dealer wasn't a DBE. Okay, so if it would come down to who ordered the bar, did the DB actually do the work or not? That's what it's going to come down to. Okay. But yes, we're looking for good faith effort stuff. Somebody threw in there the idea of a putting it in the newspaper, getting quotes, letters from DBEs in the areas that say they don't want the work or can't do the work because they're too busy. Um, the show records of proof from 10 companies, there's not an exact number. Okay. It really depends on whether you've done enough outreach to catch enough folks. Whoops, went too far. Go back here. Um, it's really the communications issue that you've got. There is a list that's available of DBs in your area, and so you'd need to go through that list. But letters, direct outreach, advertisements, emails, quotes, yeah, all these things. And remember that even after you've done this, you're going to need to continue to go forward. And there are forms. Yes, AAP 15 is a form you could use. You're going to need to continue until you either meet the goal, okay, or you can show that you've exhausted the possibilities. And they'll let you know. Okay, I've gotten a good faith effort exhaustion once on a project, so it can be done. And remember, it's got to be new efforts. You don't just keep trying to go back to the same people. Are you busy now? Are you busy now? No, you need to go to new people, new efforts. Now, if you've had somebody who says, I'm busy for 6 months, you could go back to those people. But yeah, just don't keep going back and saying, hey, I did effort. Well, I know you called the same company you knew was too busy. That won't count. You need to document it. Create a log. That's going to be your best bet. So now we take all of this and we prepare a construction management plan. In other words, pick up the phone and you meet with the RLPL, and that has in the construction management plan your milestones. Okay? It lists out your quality assurance and your quality control that you're going to be doing for the project. The tool that's used most commonly is the MERC, okay? The Manual of Uniform Record Keeping, okay? And that's where you're going to write down everything that you did. So when you're looking at your ice cream sundae, okay, that you built, is the ice cream sundae what you proposed? Do you have a plan to meet the scope? Okay. Are you documenting, hey, I got my 2 cherries, I got my hot fudge, I got my bridge concrete, I got my signpost. So it's going to have a way to do record keeping to make sure you didn't miss something. Okay. Now, QA/QC does not stand for quit asking and quit checking. Okay. So we need to figure out who's doing what. And good point here in the Q&A about who's doing this. The good faith effort, by the way, is the contractor. It's not the sponsor. I did forget to mention that. We go back to the good faith effort. It's the contractor who has to meet the requirements. You're not doing that. You're just making sure they're continuing to try. But quality control, quality assurance is a similar kind of thing. Quality assurance, some people actually will think of these things as quality assurance is the quality by the agency, where the quality of the contractor is QC. I've also heard, and I actually tend to like the idea that quality control is things you can measure. Quality assurance is things you can document that aren't, numbers. We could argue about that back and forth, but the key is having a plan. So for instance, for concrete, have you got the air? Have you got the strength? Things like that. Versus quality assurance might be something where you document how it was finished, how the concrete vibrators worked, how many of them were on site, things like that. Make sure you have a plan. Make sure you have a quality assurance program in place. It gets added to the construction management plan. This is where the inspection is added in. Okay, you're going to do your lab testing. You're going to make sure you get your certifications on everything. Okay, so make sure you've got everything that you need. Let's see. Yeah, we'll do this one. Let's just assume asphalt paving. So what kind of quality assurance items would I have for asphalt paving? I know we've been doing safety, but let's just break it up a little bit. So quality assurance, yeah, how many lifts were done? Okay, we can measure the thickness, that's quality control, but yeah, how many lifts were done? How many cycles were done with the roller? So therefore you can calculate the compactive effort, the material itself, okay? The temperatures, and some would argue that's a quality control. If you have something you're measuring against, that'd probably be a quality control, but I'm okay with quality assurance. Okay, did you have the nuke gauge? So we're not nuking the pavement, we're talking about the density. Yep. Results in reports, lists. Yeah. You can start thinking about these things, what the tickets are. Okay. What's the width? How was the paver set up? Did it have a safety edge? Did it have a Michigan wedge on the inside? Those are all things that should be documented. That's the key. What we're trying to do is document stuff so that 10 years from now, we're going back out to that roadway and we're like, edge is breaking up. Oh, well, they didn't have a safety edge and we didn't back the shoulder up. If we have good documentation, we can figure out what's going on. Okay, so you need to have a plan in place. Required on the national highway system or state highway to follow state specs and state inspection procedures. Okay, and you're going to have off-site QA procedures set in place. And of course, you're going to have to certify your steel items and your structural concrete, any bridge bearings that you've got. So, make sure you've got all that. If you're off system, again, federal aid, you're going to be doing New York State specs, but you may or may not have niced out inspections. You're going to need to check on that. Sometimes you might be able to hook into them for certain paving or bridge operations, but a lot of times you're going to have to bring in your own inspectors, and there's minimum requirements. But here's the cool thing. That is eligible. So if you have to hire inspectors, if you included it back in the beginning when you did your grant, it's eligible. So you can reimburse yourself. So let's just make a list. What's critical? What needs to be in my construction management plan? What needs to be in here? And it's the certification of inspectors. We're going to talk about inspectors in a minute, Bill. You need your staffing. You need your breakdown of cost. You need your schedule. Yep. By the way this particular one works, you put in an item, and then you can give it an upvote or a downvote. And we'll see what rises to the top. Schedule has got a lot of votes. QA/QC fan is in there. Inspection, qualifications of staff. Yeah. You're probably going to need to include some of the things from the state, like the standard specifications and the MERC and the construction manuals that are available for concrete and steel. Any inspection tests, those need to be documented and included. Again, they can be linked. There's all kind of choices that you can have for this. Let's see what else we got on the list here. Staffing, breakdown of costs. Yeah, same thing. But think about that. And if you're not sure, pick up the phone, talk to the RLPO. Okay. So guess what? I got good news for you. We're actually going to start building now. Okay. We're going to build this puppy. But you got to wait, remember, until you get that you're ready to go, that you've got the good construction management plan. You don't want to keep moving forward. So we're going to advertise to get our contractor. What's included in an advertisement for bids? What's included in an advertisement? Location. Yeah. When is it due? When's it going to be opened? Yeah. A description of the work someone put in the QA. Yeah, or scope. How long is the thing good for? What's the contract plan? Okay. Yeah. Give you about 30 more seconds. We'll see what other ones you come up. Yeah, 15. All those plans. Okay, let's go see here. Anticipated schedule. Yeah. Okay. Okay, let's see. You're going to need to make sure people know up front what are the DBE goals, because they're going to have to meet them. Remember, we just mentioned the fact that it's the contractor who has to do the good faith effort. So you need to tell them up front, here's the goal. You need to include all that PIN information, where it is and all that. We got that. Now that sounds crazy, but make sure we know who the owner is, who's the contact point, where you're actually going to open everything up, the date, the time, the venue, where to get the documents, in person, electronic, okay? Where to submit them, how to submit them, are there requirements for deposits or security required? and then, of course, who to ask questions. Okay? So those have to be in there. Um, you should be using the New York State Contract Reporter. I get that every single day. I see anywhere from 0 in some weird days, but most weekdays I see 5 to 10 items in the Contract Reporter. It's also recommended to use some local newspapers, okay? And minimum 3 weeks. Someone put over in the Q&A, you want to make sure your insurance declarations are required. Yeah, any paperwork that the bidder needs should be in there. If you're not sure, better to have it in there than not. And remember, if you make an adjustment, if you make an amendment because of a legitimate, oh, we messed something up, it has to go to all the bidders with a copy to the state DOT. Okay. So, we forgot to include the cost of the Henway. Well, you got to make sure that the Henway, everybody knows what the Henway is. So, okay, so we're in pretty good shape. We can start to build. Hey, we're getting there. Okay. So we're into the construction phase. We're doing our bidding and awarding. Okay, so to bid and award a project, you have to open the bids publicly. Okay, you open them publicly. Everybody sees the bids. Joe Dokes Enterprises, $1.34 million. Jane's Construction, $1.33 million. You then analyze the low bid. And so if the low bidder, in this case, Jane's Construction, is responsible, she can meet all the things, she's a winner. Now, you review their DBE plan and you get approval from the DOT. Let's say that the companies that put in the low bid didn't have a plan for DBE, but said they were getting one. They have 5 days to get either additional subcontractors or DBE qualifications through commercially useful functions, or they've done enough work they can illustrate a good faith effort. They give them 5 additional days. Okay? Good question. I don't know if the public postings on a bid board are available. I think they have to be done in person. But I'm going to put that into my pile because I can. We'll ask the folks from the DOT and Federal Highway. Cool thing about having a Q&A. You can't negotiate. There's no negotiation. This is not a negotiation. This is the low bidder. All you're doing is reviewing it to make sure it meets the qualifications. If they can meet it, they win. Once they've been chosen and they win, they are going to have to do civil rights recording through the EEO and DBE reporting system. It's all done via an EBO online project, ebo.dot.ny.gov. You put this in. Even if there is 0% DBE, you still need to put that information into the EBO system currently. Okay? So even if it's 0, you're still going to be using that system to monitor things. There's not a negotiated system if you only get one bidder. Somebody put in there. By the way, if you only get one bidder, the question is, do you have a legitimate thing? You can have people say they wouldn't put in, but not for this. In this case, it's low bid. Okay, you can reject all bids because they're too pricey versus the engineering estimate, but you don't negotiate in this case. Okay, so if you're not sure, again, pick up the phone, talk to your RLPL. There is a workforce participation plan. This is done by the contractor, not done by the sponsors, done by the contractor. And it really actually was the initial version of it should have actually been done by the engineer, sort of figuring out what they think was going to happen for a workforce participation plan. It's not part of the EBO system. It's separate. The engineer should have done a version of it in design to check, and then you check it versus the contractor's submission prior to starting work and see if it makes sense, if it matches up to what your expectations are. And then you monitor that as it goes through the process. So once you think you have a winner, you submit it to the DOT. Yes, there's a form you can use to do that, and you just check off. Yep, we advertised. Yep, no concerns. Yep, got the receipts. Everything's good. We move on. Okay? And then you're going to get the RLPL and the DOT are going to sign off, and you award it to the lowest responsible and responsive bidder. Okay? So you're not going to start building things, and you're going to build, build, and build some more. Okay? So let's just ask ourselves, hey, I forgot to change our picture. That's the speed table picture I had in there. I was going to try to change it on all of them. It's like 8 places it shows up. I must have only done 7. Um, Give me some typical problems you might see in construction, whether it's a bridge or a safety improvement. Give me some typical types of construction problems. Utilities, yeah. Cost, overruns, yeah. Hazard soil issues in the ground, traffic that you didn't think about. You're having a hard time getting the materials, the supply chain's bad. Somebody had a value engineering plan in the process and it's not working out. There's a sinkhole, there's weather delays, If you were trying to pave right now, it could be challenging. Yep. Okay. That's why it is so important to have a good set of scope and plans, and why it's so important to have a good construction management plan. So you've thought about this and thought about slack. I jokingly mentioned that I'm watching this huge crane that I can't even see without bending down to look out my window. Um, it's massive. Well, they were way behind when they got it put up, but now that it's on site, they're actually caught up. So they actually hope to be ahead of schedule here soon, but of course the weather has kicked them back to being, well, they hope to stay on schedule. Um, so think about those construction problems. And remember, what is your ADA plan? What is your QA/QC plan? What are your material certifications? What's your inspection? All of those things can help you when it comes to dealing with those construction problems. Okay? Now, before you turn a spade, you really need to have a pre-construction conference, and that includes, obviously, the sponsor. Okay? It includes the contractor that you've selected. It includes any inspection firm, if you're hiring an outside one, or your own people if it's an internal. Okay? And the DOT. That's usually the RLPL or or her representative. Okay? So you have a pre-construction conference, go over everything that's important, make sure everybody's on the same page. We don't want to miss anything. And there are certain notifications. Once they start working, they have to notify the workers. Now, in the Q&A, I'm not going to do this as a poll. I'm just going to do this as a Q&A. Tell me 2 problems with what you see about trying to notify the workers of their rights. These are the sheets you put up to tell them their rights under the law in terms of prevailing wage, in terms of work hours, in terms of safety. What do you see in the way of problems here? I see about 5, but I'm going to have you just give me 2. You can't get there. There's too much debris that's piled up, so you can't get to it. Yep. Yeah, where you placed it. And actually, one of the other problems with this one is it's outside. Day like today, it's raining. It's going to rain tomorrow. Rained yesterday. What's going to happen to pieces of paper when it rains on them every single day for a week or 2? Are they really going to replace those sheets? Are they going to get faded in the sun? They need to be placed in such a way that everybody can see them. Much like a SWIP for stormwater, anything you're notifying the workers needs to be in a place where they can see it easily and not have to clamber over to get to it. So, got to notify people things. You want to think about construction safety. Make sure everybody has taken the OSHA 10-hour course that's working on the site. Make sure they're trained for traffic control if there's a traffic control operation involved. Make sure they have the proper PPE to deal with the conditions. If it's a site where they need to be using, for instance, the newer style chin strap hard hats, you need to make sure that's included. And you can actually input that into the construction management plan. Now, you're going to have inspectors. This is done by the sponsor. Okay, officially it's the project manager who's dealing with this, but on site it will be the engineer in charge. And there will be field inspectors out there. They will be following to make sure everybody meets the state specifications. Okay, and again, you can contract it, you can do it in-house, you can get paid for this if it's included back at the beginning in your scope when you put in your grant. Okay? You're going to look at the shop drawings. You may even need to go to the shop to actually inspect the plant where things are being manufactured or made. Or you can at least look at the approvals. If there's structural work, you absolutely have to approve it, sign off on it. Okay. Now, how many inspectors do you need? There are minimum standards. Okay. So for the project size, certain level of NICEAD inspectors, National Inspection Certification for Engineering and Technology. Ooh, pulled that one out of my head because I forgot to write it in my notes. Um, there are different levels, okay, going from low to high. So how many people do you need to have? Well, a small project, $500,000 or less, you need 1.5. Now, we're not taking the inspector and cutting them in half. That really wouldn't work too well. What they're saying is they're going to be half time, okay? They're not full-time kind of things. So we look at that. Remember, that's the minimum. If you feel and you can justify there is more need, you can add more people, but make sure you include that in your management plan and in your design approval document. Now, I'm only showing you up to $10 million size projects, but I know a lot of you have bigger projects. The table that's available in the local projects manual goes up to $1 billion. Above $1 billion, I think you need to talk to your RLPL or the state and the feds about how many we actually need to have for inspections. Because the job of the inspections is multiple. First off, they're obviously there to help with the contract administration and the documentation of the project. They're really going to help you with records management and coordination. But if you really think about it, the real job of the inspector is to make sure you got what you paid for. Okay? And if they see something, they need to say something, not just document it and put it into the box. So you really need to tell people what's going on. And hey, there's an issue here. New York State DOT will be doing some inspection as well. They'll be sending people out in certain situations. And their goal is to assure FHWA that the contract is meeting the federal requirements. And they're not doing the day-to-day inspections, but the idea will be to look at making sure that everything has been met according to the FHWA requirements. So the job of the inspector. A lot of folks think the job of the inspector is to do observations because in the writings it says they should observe the conditions, the criterion that are being followed, the cause for any defects, the effect of those causes on the overall project, and they're done, right? Well, the problem is if all they do is write it down and put it into a book, does it make things better? No. So the real job of the inspector is to not just observe these things, but to then figure out and let somebody know so something can be changed. So I'm going to give you an example. Okay, so you're the inspector in this job. It's a roadway delineation meeting the MUTCD. Okay, and you're going down along the job. And so what do we observe for conditions? What's what's the problem here? Well, what do you think? In Q&A, somebody tell me do you see any conditions here, any criterion that aren't being met? What do you think the cause is? Yeah, there's a sign that's low. Um, Actually, yeah, it's more than just the sign being low. It's pointing in the wrong direction. The effect could be a crash because you've given people information that's incorrect. Okay? So what do you think happened? If you look carefully, you can actually see, and let me get my pen working here. I'll get a color you guys can see. I think white will work. You can actually see this post goes to here. And if you get out and you actually look, yeah, somebody put it. It wasn't a bolt loose. The bolt sheared that was here, so the sign flipped upside down. Now, some people will say, well, hey, I inspected it and I made all the notes. But if it gets put in a drawer, it doesn't do any good. You've got to let somebody know so it can be fixed. Okay? Now, if this was on a brand new site, it could have been they over-tightened the bolt or they didn't put on the proper lock nut. If it's on an older site where they're inspecting it, it could be the bolt sheared or rusted. But the key is you got to figure out what it needs to be done. Let somebody know who can get these things changed. And that actually is something I've heard from quite a few folks that a lot of times the inspectors just tell me what's wrong and don't help us figure out and get the problem solved. Okay? Now, part of the reason we don't want to do that is because people, well, a lot of people hate change orders. There seems to be an aversion to change orders. Now, we don't want a situation like this. If you look at the name of the boats, I stole this off the internet, and I used the Microsoft. These are Community Commons pictures. And it says the original contract, that's the little dinghy, and the big boat says change orders. We don't want that. Now, if you hear the term order on contracts, and that's written in state documentation, um, it's the same thing. There's no difference. It's a change order. Okay. So I'm going to ask you, give me some legitimate change order items. Tell me some things that, yep, that's a legitimate change order. Okay. Unforeseen conditions. But what does unforeseen mean? Yeah, a sinkhole that's being backfilled. The particular material isn't available. Over in the Q&A, I see a possible scope change, a utility. Price went up. Ooh, price went up. Is that a legitimate change order? A lot of times, no. That's not a legitimate change order just because the price went up. That's the contractor's responsibility. Okay? Now, if it price went up and there had been a delay caused by something, that's one thing. But just the price went up? Maybe not. They hit rock that wasn't expected. Weather impacts above what would be considered reasonable would be okay. Additional signage, additional work, yes, that's possible. But remember, a change order has to be something that is truly unforeseen, undocumented. Yeah, COVID was a perfect example. A lot of change orders occurred because when COVID hit. Okay. A utility that wasn't there, a design error could lead to that. Okay. It could be a delay caused by others. But yeah, if it's something they should have known about, yeah, it could be. So that's just think about that. So a contract change, remember, it's a change to scope. Okay. Um, it could be a change in the price. It could be a change in the plans or the specifications. It could even be a new or modified pay item. These are all things that would require possibly a change orders. Okay. It may even adjust when the payments are due to the contract or change in what's required. An example might be we've realized that we need to change from standard hot mix to warm mix asphalt concrete during this project. So we're going to be using warm mix from now on. Well, that's a change in the contract. You're using a different material. Perfectly legit. And that could be something that you could possibly even get a difference in payment if there's a legitimate difference in the payments. It's really the idea of the unforeseen. So for instance, unforeseen conditions in utilities. So someone asked, how would I handle the tariffs that have come into play? Well, it would come down to when were the tariffs applied versus when the contract was placed. If you already had a contract in place and the tariffs are applied, that'd be one question. But if you knew about them ahead of time, that would be another. Now, whether someone would count that as legitimate or not, I don't know. My own personal opinion, completely independent of what someone else might say, would be if it occurred before the contract was due and you knew it was coming, no, that's not a legitimate change order. If it occurred after the contract had been awarded and you couldn't make a change, that might be a legitimate change order. But again, you'd have to check with DOT and with Federal Highway on that. Here's the thing to think about this. Ask yourself those old questions from school. Who, what, where, when, what, how, and why. Okay? And by the way, we usually list who first, but I actually like to start with the why. Why is the change necessary? What is the change? How will it impact the scope of the design, such as an approved document? Where is the change in the project? When is it affecting the project? Who's responsible for the difference? If it's the contractor, maybe it's not a legitimate change order. And then, of course, who should pay comes into play. They're done. There is a standard in the MERC that you can use. They are reviewed by the DOT if they're anything more than what's known as de minimis, just a minor change. Okay. You don't need it, for instance, a minor change within the scope, a small quantity increase or decrease. You know, you were putting up 500 delineator posts and now it's 520. Okay, that's a minor quantity increase or decrease, as long as the overall price isn't changing, and it stays under the amount available in the bid, you're probably okay. Not significant new items is the key. Okay? Changes within an existing change. You realize that somebody wrote up a change order and you've approved it and you have to do a minor change, probably okay. But if you're not sure, guess what? All you got to do is three things: communicate and communicate. Oh, and communicate. Um, because that's the key here. Now, if it changes the design, as someone is saying in the Q&A, do you have to resubmit the design approval document? Well, yes and no. You're getting a change order that's, this case, it does have to be approved by the DOT, and you should document that change within the design approval document. But remember, they're signing off. So essentially, it is a change to the design approval document, but you don't have to go all the way back and rebid. You update the design approval document in this particular case. But it does have to be documented. And again, like all these things, if you're not sure, pick up the phone because it's the RLPL who's going to be reviewing it anyway. Now, you're going to get reimbursed. You can only get reimbursed on an active project with an active PIN. And it has to be eligible. And you have to show proof of payment, i.e. a canceled check, a bank transfer. I never remember those four letters that start with A, AICH. Maybe I got that right. The point is you have to have proof of payment. And there are some reporting requirements. ACH, thank you. There are some federal reporting requirements. Now, you need to be working towards meeting the EEO DBE goals. Okay. And in certain places, you have to meet those requirements, so they might actually hold the funds for reimbursement, depending on what you've said in your construction management plan. Excuse me, the contractor has said in their construction management plan. Here's the nice thing. If you're thinking about the amount of cash that you have to do the project as a local agency, progress payments can be made monthly. So you don't have to carry the entire project with cash. You have to be able to carry a few months. And the reason I say a few months is because while it's generally monthly, there can be delays. There could also be issues with maybe it's more expensive for a short period of time. So, think about what's going to be the most expensive month or two. That's the amount of cash you want to have on hand. You should be okay in most cases, but something to think about. Any work that's performed, you can get reimbursed, including the stockpiling of materials. So if somebody's bringing in, 800 delineator posts and they're going to stockpile them at a yard, you can pay for those posts as long as you do document that those posts are in a semi-secure location, not going to get stolen. If they get stolen and you didn't protect them, you may not get reimbursed, or the contractor may not get reimbursed. An estimate is prepared by the engineer in charge, and they're going to send that on. Okay? They should be timely. There's no point in waiting. Okay? And remember, it has to be an active project. If it's inactive, you actually have to go through the process of getting it reactivated. And if it's inactive for long enough, FHW make it inactive, and then you're going to have to go through the process of getting it reactivated. That could be a pain. It has to be compliant. Make sure that you follow all the requirements. And again, if you're not sure, ask. So let's talk about a few issues. Actually, I tell you what, I'm a big fan, remember, of the mind absorbing. We'll come back to the issues and what might happen with that after we take our last break for the day. So we'll take a 15-minute break and we will see you at 1:45. Good thing I'm watching the clock. See you at 1:45. Okay, so our last half hour of new content, then we'll get to our Q&A. Got a whole bunch of good questions that have been submitted, and again, keep submitting them. Any way you can get them to us, we'll try to add them in the pile. So if there are issues with your contract, if something happens, here's the good news. The good news is the FHWA and the DOT want you to succeed. So before they do anything, with some exceptions, this might be one, they're going to want to have a corrective action plan. They're going to have you put this together. There may be some additional things that are added, but the idea is how do we get things back on track? They might do this through an auditing system. They might just ask you for some additional monitoring. They might pull out one of those financial reviews we talked about earlier. The goal is to not get to the thing we don't want, and that is where they're actually pulling funds. That is known, by the way, as a feign. Okay. Um, you don't want a feign. Okay. And we'll come back to a couple of examples of that in a little bit. That's essentially an eligibility notice. Okay. So if you can't do something, the ultimate expression is to go to a federal aid ineligibility notice or a feign. We don't want that, and neither does FHWA nor does DOT. Those occur when essentially you're not able to correct the problem, and there's not, a way to overcome that. So if, you poured structural concrete and you have no way to test the quality of the concrete, well, then you would have to be thinking about getting a feign, though there are exceptions to that. And I'm just going to share you an example or two of that in just a second. This is all outlined in chapter 3. Okay. So looking at the Q&A, I'm going to stare at the Q&A here. Do you see a couple of possible issues here where, if this was inspectors were looking at this, they might pull some funds because you weren't following standards protocol? What do you see here? There's no PPE on the worker, no vest, no hard hat. There's nothing protecting the end of those rebar. Okay. So you really need to have those things, or they may threaten to pull some funds. Okay. Most likely, if they see that once, they're going to go, hey, you need to correct these things. They see it a second time, or maybe depending on the level, they might say you're going to have to put together a plan to improve things. But at some point, they may pull funds from you. So how about this one? Do you see any problems here? There are two that are should be pretty obvious. There is nothing to protect that water. It's an erosion problem. You really need to do a much better job of getting water safely through the site and clean. There's no silt fencing. There's no erosion control. They're working in the stream itself, and none of the people are wearing all the PPE they have to have. You really need to have vest on. That is actually a requirement. Even though this is a semi-closed project, you still have to have a vest on in this particular case. So again, think about what people need to have. If you're not sure, ask. Now, in this particular case, this is one where they did the concrete testing. I told you. Normally you'd be thinking, what are we going to do? Well, they decided they would go to the effort of testing the concrete. So they had people come in, drill cores. The cores were then taken back, and they were compressed. It was a sidewalk job. I think it saved Fruits to School, but I'm not positive on that. It cost them $40,000 to do all of the testing that they had to do. The project only netted $50,000. So in other words, they spent most of their money they got doing the testing. At some point, you might go, well, I guess we're going to have to take that hit. Okay. Someone asked for the last one, is that safety vest or flotation? You have to have a safety vest, as type you have in a roadway in every case. Flotation would be required only in certain streams. Again, what are the proper PPE? Do you see a possible feign problem here? The answer is, well, there's ADA issues. Yeah, it certainly is. If that was a brand new construction, it has to be completely flat. That's not a proper PPE boot, but maybe it is. I think that's actually my non-proper PPE, Merrill. I actually have one that is a PPE compliant hard toe. Actually, the requirement for ADA these days is 0. The ADA sidewalk requirement is now flush. It's not a half inch anymore. Now, this particular one occurred afterwards due to frost heaving. So it might not have been part of the construction, but if it occurred during construction, yes, it could be. So can you think of some other things that might come up that you'd be in threat of losing funds? And they're both structural things and paperwork things. So let's see if you can come up with just a few. And then we're going to close this project out. Not meeting the DBE requirements. Yep. You forget to do proper shoring. Yep, that's a good one. In fact, got one in the Q&A and one in the poll everywhere at the same time. Cracks that are structural. Yeah, some issues with the materials. Yep. Work outside the right of way. You failed to follow the Uniform Act. You didn't do a proper job with your work zones or your PPE. You didn't do a good job with your record keeping. They really hate that one. It sounds minor now, but it's 50 years from now when you're looking at it, you're like, what did they do? That could be important. Wetland issues, environmental issues, failure to document and specify things, um, working outside, you may not get paid by America. Yeah. Again, the whole point is you go back and you look at the construction management plan, the design approval document. And if you're following that, you're good. If you don't, that's where they're going to be talking about it. And again, they don't want to do a feign. What they really want to do is, okay, how do we correct this? We'll create a correction action plan, get you do it right, and then we can move forward. Okay, that's really their goal. And should be in every case. Okay, so let's close this project out because things shouldn't happen. They don't happen a lot. I don't want you to be thinking of that. Really what I want you to focus on is getting a job done right. That's what everybody wants. So we're going to close out the project. We're going to finish the completion of the project. We're going to do final inspection. Yay! We like final inspection. You're going to have the RLPL out there to look at the site with you. FHW may or may not be on the site, depending, but ROPL needs to be there, and you're going to do a contract closeout. And obviously, that means you're going to have to do documentation, the punch list, all that stuff. You're going to make eventually a final reimbursement request, and there's going to be a form to fill out for final acceptance. Yay! Now, if it's on the state highway, there's an additional step to get approval from the state. Okay? And it is required to have as-built plans if you're on the national highway or state highway system, or if it's a bridge. It is a good idea in any case to have good as-built plans. And part of this final report is any financial summaries that you've got. Now, you're probably wondering, do I have to have an audit at the end of the project? Well, it depends, okay? You need to document the date of the most recent single audit if you're over $750,000, or the date of a consultant audit if it's above 300,000. Okay, and again, sometimes that's all you have to have, or you might have to have a new audit put into place. Okay, and then of course all your final reports, and that includes the DBE, EEO, any payments to the contractor and their subs. Okay, and you're probably going, oh, what else have I got to include? Well, again, good news. I love forms. I hate paperwork. There's a form for that. There's a project checklist. And don't read it. I know you're all thinking the font's too small. The form is on the web and essentially goes with everything, and you just check, yep, 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 and we're done. Okay? You inspect that everything is done. You are sure that you did it by the contract. You have an agreement, and then you have to keep the records for certain periods. We'll talk about records retention here in just a sec. Now, you're going to review the project records. You're going to verify that they've been done, and you are going to have a punch list. I will be very surprised that when you're done, you're like, this didn't get done. Well, that means the project's not done yet. That punch list is essentially here's the last few things we have to do to get that project done. So before final acceptance, you're going to make sure there's no outstanding claims, that punch list has been completed, there's no unfinished work, there's no pending issues like paperwork, there's no pending issues like we didn't get the deeds filed at the clerk's office or something like that. So you just need to make sure everything is included. So let's just do a quick check. Give me 5 or 6 things. Let's throw them into here. In here. And while you're doing that, somebody asked the question, why not require as-built for all projects? Again, I recommend as-built for all projects. It's just not a requirement. What we should do and what's required are not always the same. So I like the idea of as-built in every case. They're just required in certain situations, but it's still a good idea. Load ratings, yeah. The final engineering design actually would be probably the best way to say that. A final bill, yeah, or estimate in the voucher, yeah. Let's see if we can get 3 or 4 more. That everything's actually completed and the commitments are done. So if you put in grass, there's actually grass growing. There's good shop drawings and as-built on those shop drawings. You've got photos. You've got your agreements in place. Yeah. You actually have a certification that the sponsor, i.e. the local owner, has said, yep, this is good. You have your daily work reports. You have your certification of your payments. Now, I will tell you, when you start thinking about these items, think about how long you need to keep them, and you may want to file them in separate places. And we'll talk about why in just a sec. But the idea is, once you've done all this, you can then move on to that final voucher. What's going to happen is you're going to submit your final bill to the DOT. DOT is going to submit a final voucher to the FHWA. They're going to do a final completeness review for the finance side and approve it and then pay the DOT back. Okay? But by then, you've already been paid. And the only reason they come back to you is if they find something in the audit. If you've done your job right, you never hear from them again. Because remember, DOT is the one who pays the sponsor. Now, how long do you keep things? Well, that's why I like to keep things in bins. Things that are engineering related, they go in a box that says forever. Everything else depends on what it is. So, for instance, uh, documents such as the who did what, 3 years minimum. You have to be able to be audited, essentially, 3 years. Unless you're on a state highway system, then it's 10 years. And there's requirements out there. There's an EB for that. You don't have to read it. It's available in the state's EB system. Okay. It's EB 20-029. It lists that out. Here's the one that's going to cause you the most grief. And that is if it involves Marcia Shelley, which is the supplemental funds that go with state aid in a lot of cases, state fundings, that's 15 months extra. Okay. That's easy, right? So I got 3 years for most things, add 15 months, piece of cake. But if it involves something that is bonded, okay, as Marcia Shelley and CHIPS funds are bonded, you got to keep them for 36 years. Yeah, 36 years. And the reason it has to do that is it's the nature of the bond. Okay? Because in this case, what happens is a secondary timing hits, which is 6 years, 30-year bond, hence 36 years. Okay? My advice is, as you're documenting these things, put them in boxes with dates for when you can get rid of them. And the easiest thing to remember, if it's related to the structure of the bridge or the design of the road, you have to keep them essentially until those things are no longer there, i.e. forever. If it's related to the contract, you have to keep it anywhere from 3 to 6 years, depending on where it fits. And there's some exceptions, such as if you got some state aid, you may have to keep them for 36 years. Write it right on the box. It's the easiest way to do it. Now, you may get an audit that comes in and they check things. Who can do an audit? Well, everybody can do an audit. State can do an audit. FHWA can do an audit. Heck, EPA can come in and do an audit. The single most important thing to solve this problem is have good documentation. Okay? If you got more than $750,000 in a fiscal year from the feds, you're going to get an audit. Okay? You're going to get a single audit. Okay? Now, if it was for a single project, you might get one specifically for that. If not, they're going to look at your whole entity. So just be aware of that. Okay? So just be aware you may get audited. Don't, my wife gets worried about audits. Audits are audits. Okay? So now we're going to maintain this. And remember, when we're maintaining it, it's no longer a federal project. When we're maintaining it, it's no longer state oversight. So you're going to be operating and maintaining that facility. Okay? Now, realize how are you going to fund it? How are you going to pay for this? Okay? What is the maintenance that you have to do? So what I recommend to anybody when you're doing a project, go back to the beginning when you're planning and identifying it and think about when it's done, what's going to be the annual cost? And how do I make sure in the annual cost that I cover every single thing I need to cover? Because otherwise you've got the situation where you could have an issue. So maybe you change your design and change your bridge design for less maintenance. Maybe you use a little stronger post for a sign so it lasts a little bit longer with good breakaway hardware. So that's why I like to do the entire project on paper before I go and read the notice of funding opportunity, or just after I have, before I apply to decide, is it worth it or not? And what is the most important thing? Tell me in the Q&A, what's the single most important thing? What do you think the most important thing to have successful federal project is? Yeah, very good. Yeah, it's communication. That is by far. It is the only answer that every person I asked as we were developing this class, every single one of them said communication was the key to success. So you're thinking, well, what do I do? Where can I get some assistance? So where where can you go to get some help? If you're not sure, you should have, I hope you've got about 6 or 7 people you can think of. You can always look online. There's tons of stuff out there. Your RLPL, very good. If I had to pick one thing that popped up first, that's really good. Federal projects, make sure you know your regional and local project liaison, RLPL, local rep, whatever you want to call them is. Absolutely. It's your regional folks. Where else could you go? You can always check with the DOT's website, look in the local projects manual. Okay, local programs can help you. FHWA can help you. They're limited in staff, but they can help you. Check with an engineering firm. If an engineering firm's done a bunch of projects, they probably have somebody who knows can answer your question. Okay. If you are inside of an MPO, why don't you check with an MPO? You can check with us, with the LTEP Center. Okay. Yeah, we can help you out. Okay. Why don't you check with another county or another agency that's nearby who may have done projects? Okay. The idea is if you're not sure, go get some help. There's never a problem having help. Okay. It may be time. In fact, that's the one thing you have to give them is time. But that's something that you can always go get help if you're not sure. Okay. So what I want to do is give you a few example projects, um, just to show you that there's lots of federal aid out there, and there's some pretty cool stuff. I'm just going to show you a few examples. I pulled up one of my safety ones that I got. So here's an example. This one was actually done jointly by Dutchess County and the town of Wappinger. You got to have a lead agency, by the way, if you bundle two agencies together. So whether you want Dutchess County to be the lead or the town of Wappinger depends on who they have for a project manager, who can manage these projects. Okay. But in this case, they improved the safety on a county road and the town road intersections that came with it. Total project cost, $9 million. Federal aid was 75%, state aid was 19%, and the local aid portion was only 6%. And they improved the site distances, they looked at the rail, the signs, drainage, all that fun stuff. Okay? Rail Trail project. This is a transportation enhancement project in the town of Yorktown, Yorktown Heights. The old train station was right along the trail, of course, and they restored it. And they turned it into a museum and a rest stop. Okay? In this particular case, $400,000, 2/3 federal, 1/3 local. There was no state additional help, but again, it made the project feasible for the folks at Yorktown Heights. Okay. Obviously, we know about bridges, and by the time you do bridges, you can really stretch your dollars. This particular bridge was in the village of Mamaroneck. Now, this is an interesting one. Um, most of the time, a village bridge would actually be the responsibility of the town, but in this case, it was actually the responsibility of the village. Um, total cost, about $3 million. Federal aid did not cover the 90% you might expect, or 80% with the state marshal's tele. It was actually mostly federal, but about 40% was local because they did some existing work, additional work that was outside what the covered by the bridge federal aid. The city of Rochester did a road diet. Safety improvements are in there. This particular one, this is you know, I don't have the exact numbers for this one. The estimate was $12.6 million to redo that corridor from 4 lanes to 3. Now, I will tell you, if you haven't seen this, road diets are currently not listed. I don't know why, but they are not listed. So road diets were pulled out. So if you're thinking of a road diet, be careful. Make sure you read the notice of funding opportunities because these things change. But I want to leave that in there just to remind you that what might have been approved in the past may not, and it may come back. You never know. Make sure you've read the NOFO. Rail Trail, Ulster County. Okay, there's an example. A lot of rail trails are done this way with federal aid. But here's the thing I always think about whenever you're doing a rail trail project or any project, who's going to maintain the trail afterwards? Because that's not going to be federal. That's going to be done with local dollars. And Ulster County has to be able to maintain it after. afterwards. This was done with Transportation Alternative Programming Funds. City of Kingston updated Hurley Avenue. They did ADA and bicycle improvements, 80% federal, 20% local. Okay, so they put in ADA accessible curb ramps. They put in slight widening of the shoulder to give them enough room to put in a bicycle lane, as you can see, markings, all that fun stuff. And again, great project. Who's going to maintain the markings afterwards? Who's going to maintain the ramps? Make sure you have a plan in place. Don't build something and then not have a plan for it. That could be a problem for you. Okay. Now, what I want to do, and you've got your handout, you've got a handout there, and there's a whole bunch of acronyms. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through, we got a few minutes here. Okay, and then we'll do our Q&A. I want to go through and I'm going to put down a couple of my favorite acronyms. Let me find my favorite acronyms list. There it is. I'm going to write the acronym on the screen, and I want you to tell me what it stands for in the Q&A box. So let me get my pen working here. Okay, let's go with, oh, we talked about this one quite often. So let's go with this one. QBS. What is QBS? QBS. Quality-based selection. Very good. Nice job. That's essentially the technique you use to select your engineer. Has to have, essentially the idea is we're looking at their qualifications. Okay? So there you go. Okay? I see your question. We'll get back to your question a little bit. Maybe we'll actually even ask the folks on the Q&A here in a couple of minutes. Let's do with this one. Let's go with PMP. And no, it does not stand for Poor Man's Pizza. Project Management Plan. Very good. Very good. Essentially, this is the plan for getting the work done. Okay? Yep. Oh, what the heck? Let me give a, well, we'll give you an easy one. RLPL. Regional Local Project Liaison. Yep. These are the people at your regional office. If you don't know them, get to know them. They can answer your questions, okay? But you got to give them the most valuable thing you've got, and that is time. Okay, I'll do two more, and then we're going to switch over, see what questions, additional questions you've got. This isn't an acronym, but this is a pretty important one. If I say division, and I'm talking about FHWA, what does that mean? What does the FHWA division mean? A little more challenging. I'm making them think this morning, Chris, or afternoon. See, they're thinking. It's a division, but what's a division? As in local or regional office. You're getting there, you're getting close. Regional area? Not quite. A division, especially here in New York, is an office of the Federal High Administration that oversees federal projects within New York State. They don't call it the FHWA state office because that could get very confusing with the New York State DOT. So when you hear the term FHWA division, they're talking about a subset of the national FHWA that services a particular area. Here in New York, it's New York State Division Office. Okay, last one. Last one. Oh, let's pick, nah, I won't do that one. Let's do this one. PM. PM, not time of day. It's 2:10 p.m., but what is PM in the world of federal aid? Project manager. Yeah. And where does the project manager have to work? Where does the project manager have to work? We'll see if we can get that in the local. They have to work full time for the sponsor. Yeah. Which in the case of a local project is the local government, town, county, city, state, and some can go through an MPO, Metropolitan Planning Organization. Okay, I think those are the ones that are some of the most challenging ones. There's a whole bunch of others. Again, take your time. Once you know all of those, if you can come in here and go and look at all those acronyms and know them all, you're well on your way to being a federal aid guru rather than just a federal aid user. So let's see if there's any last few questions that people have. People have put a few things in there. Okay, so for instance, um, prevailing wage responsibilities. Okay, so I can add that one to the list. This is pretty cool. I can just copy here. Okay, with that, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the Q&A panel. Okay,